Hi, everybody. Thanks for showing up a few minutes early. I'll get started in 3 or 4 minutes, just doing some admin things in the background. In case you're interested, there are some reference materials up in the nest that you might be interested in. Hi, Sam. Thanks very much for joining us. You're coming through loud and clear. How are you doing?
I'm very, very good.
Perfect. We are just waiting a minute or two. We'll get started at 4. And for those who have just joined us, there are some resources up in the nest that you might be interested in to get ahead of the curve on the conversation.
Okay, I'm going to go on mute.
Okay, everybody, it's 4 o'clock, so we'll get started. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you're new to these conversations, I hold these spaces every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time and each Thursday evening at 9 o'clock Eastern. The purpose of the spaces is to run through developments in the news. We rely on, plenty of mainstream news sources, but then we try to augment that heavily by looking at open source investigation, open source analysis. At the same time, we try to introduce techniques and tools so that if you either haven't begun to do your own sort of open source investigation, or if you're still new to it and developing your skills, hopefully we can all bring our skills up together as a group. And then finally, we like to bring in people, either experts or people who are working on projects, because I think there's a lot of scope to be connecting people who are connected to the OSINT world in order to build opportunities for collaboration. In my spaces, I rely fairly heavily on use of the nest, which is the portion of the window at the top of the screen where there are links to individual tweets. I do that so that when I run through news, you don't just have to rely on me. You can see my sources for almost all the statements I make. As well, that way, if something interests you, you can go and take that reading away with you. We're joined today by Sam Bendet, who will be speaking about Russian crowdsourcing efforts in terms of equipment. And we'll speak with Sam in probably about 10 minutes. I'm going to start the space out by running through a couple of the resources that I normally like to highlight. That way it gives the audience an opportunity to build up. So we'll speak with Sam, and just as an FYI, Sam has limited time with us, so we're going to chat with him in an interview format today. So if any questions occur to you as we're having our conversation, please send those questions to either myself or to one of my co-hosts by DM, and we'll try and work them in. Following the chat with Sam, we have some friends of the space who we're hoping will drop by, who are engaged in similar efforts on the Ukrainian side in terms of raising crowdfunding and purchasing equipment. So we're hoping to get both some analysis of the Russian side and some insight on the Ukrainian side. And then we'll move on to some international updates. There's a lot happening in the world today, including particularly the Turkish election, and it will have knock-on effects for the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And I know results are trickling in, but hopefully you guys can be patient because I don't think there will be anything definitive for the next while. And then, of course, we'll move on to Ukraine updates, and that will probably be about the second half of our show. So just looking at the contents of the nest, if you start in the far right, that's the invitation to this space. But below that, if you click through to that thread, it's essentially my speaking notes or agenda, where you'll find all of the sources. In that way, you can look ahead a little bit and perhaps develop questions or comments for when we come to topics you're interested in. The second item is the second item is a link to the space held by Tochny, which are friends of our space, and they do a conversation that is dedicated purely to analysis of events in Ukraine. We often touch on matters in Ukraine, having been inspired by the developments there, but we try to broaden it out to tools and techniques and to regions beyond Ukraine as well in terms of OSINT. But their talk just wrapped up, and you can find the link to their conversation there. The third item is our community calendar, which once again, there are several friendly people to us here on Twitter who hold talks, and they generally relate to OSINT topics as well, whether it be Ukraine. I believe there is an Iranian space on there. But since we had developed that for internal planning of spaces purposes, we also included external events, lots of talks by universities and think tanks. Usually when you click on an item, so it will open up in a web browser for you. And if you click on an item in the calendar, it will bring up details. Usually there is a registration link, or if you click on past events, there is often a link that will take you to a recording. I'll highlight a handful of events coming up this week. So there is a talk that's being held by the Kiev School of Economics. That's what's going on with sanctions against Russia. And it has two experts who I follow closely, Agatha Demaray and Alina Rybakova. And that will be on May the 15th. So that's tomorrow. So I think I'll probably tune into that one. There is also a conversation being put on by the think tank CSIS about whether Australia, the nature that Australia should take in pursuing the review and publication of a national defense strategic review. And so that conversation is on Wednesday. I'll note that friends of ours, Andrew Perpetua, who comes to speak with us from time to time, he is continuing to do his YouTube presentations on the Ukraine battlefield update Tuesday and Thursday nights. I'm mentioning it specifically this week because our own Exit, my co-host today, will be joining Andrew. So you can joining Andrew on this coming Tuesday night. So I'd encourage you guys to tune in to that. It's at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And then finally, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies is holding a talk also on the 17th on the history of NATO enlargement from the Cold War through to the Russia-Ukraine war, which is obviously a subject that has been much in the news. There were a couple of interesting podcasts this week. The Russian language newspaper Meduza has a podcast they call The Naked Pravda, or The Naked Truth. They spoke with a couple of experts, including Rob Lee this week, about what Ukraine may be doing behind enemy lines. There was also a Twitter space on Friday, and in fact, one of the two guests was Sam Bendet, who we're speaking to today. That conversation was about whether drones are redefining the war in Ukraine, and there was much conversation about the impact of the drone attack against the Kremlin. And that was an episode of the Global Gambit recorded here on Twitter. I often like to bring up a couple of good examples, I think are good OSINT examples from the last couple of days. It's a bit smaller selection this week. There are only two. I'll put them up individually in the nest. One of them is from GeoConfirmed, and the other is from sort of a third-party gentleman. So I'll explain those two. The first by GeoConfirmed. These were recent strikes in Luhansk, and I thought this was particularly interesting. If you look at the graphic, what they did was they took many different pieces of video footage of explosions that happened in Luhansk, and they managed to geolocate them all, including the orientation of the camera based on its surroundings. And they took all of the lines of the angles of recording and they mapped them out. And what they discovered is that while many of the videos intersected at one point, there was another set of videos that actually intersected at a second point. And when there are strikes in a city because of the cityscape, and those strikes may take place, sometime apart, when you only have video from a city, the assumption most people would make is that all of the recordings are of the same strike. But by overlapping it on the map here, they were able to show that no, in fact, there were two different strikes because the footage was focused on two different locations. So I thought that was a particularly interesting example of OSINT from the last couple of days, and obviously GeoConfirmed is one of the best at it. The other item I've put in the nest as what I think is a good example is a link to a new interactive map that's been developed on Google. We have spoken many times about the work that is being done by Brady Afric to track the fortifications of the Russians. And this is a similar effort. I don't think there's any problem with having overlapping efforts to the extent that it allows for double check, verification, and even a little bit of healthy competition, which can be good. So it's great to see somebody else putting in the time to try to develop another comprehensive map of Russian defensive positions. So check that out if that's one of the subjects that you're interested in. And then finally, just before turning to our guest, I'll note I've put up several links that address an overview of the situation in Ukraine. I often put up several of the efforts by mappers. This week I've put up War Mapper and the Institute for the Study of War. I have also put up, for context, a handful of threads on analysis, the first of which is from General Mark Hertling, talking about when will the offensive start. And he speaks about it generally from the perspective of if you are a commander and you're in the position of training lots of new troops and receiving lots of new equipment, you can only incorporate those so fast. And so it's a little bit more abstract explanation of what it's likely Ukraine is focused on and why it's probably best not to rush. So that was a thoughtful thread. There is also a thread up there that is an analysis of some of the recent developments around Bakhmut from Emil Castahelmi. And it's now, I think it was put up yesterday, so it may be a tiny bit behind the times, but I thought it was well done and should be used as an example. And then finally, Dara Massicott, who is with the RAND Institute, wrote a thread with her thoughts on what the likely effectiveness of Russian defensive efforts would be. And again, lots of great thoughts in there. So I thought it would add helpful context. So that's it's a little bit shorter set of resources for this week, but hopefully that gives you a few things to dive into, catches some of your interest. And as a final note, up in the nest, as is normally the case, friends of our space are streaming our conversation to YouTube. I would encourage you to come to our live conversations, because it's only here on Twitter that you can join with your comments and questions. But if you ever miss an episode, or if you'd like to go back and try to listen to a portion of a conversation we've had before, you can always go to the YouTube channel. The friends of ours have set it up as OSINT-TV, and you'll find recordings of most of our conversations there. Okay, so that's all the introductory material. We're going to have a conversation now with Sam Bendet. Sam is probably familiar to many of you. He does great analysis. He's focused particularly on developments in drone technology and artificial intelligence and the implications for military operations of those two fields. He wears several hats. Among those, he works with the Center for Naval Analysis, and I believe it's also the Center for New American Security. And he and I have chatted a few times before, but this is the first time that he's joined us on one of our discussions. So, Sam, thank you very much for coming to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be on your podcast.
So we've heard you in conversation several times before. Usually you've been talking about the general importance of drones in the war in Ukraine, which is a fascinating topic. So I was particularly interested when you had said to us that you wanted to speak about a slightly different angle of that same question today, and that you wanted to talk about the crowdsourcing efforts in Russia. And I know that a lot of that is aimed toward the purchase of drones, but I thought that was a fascinating topic. So what inspired you to think that would be an important one for us to cover?
Well, I think it's an important topic because every time Russian media, Russian volunteers, any of the Russian Telegram channels are discussing acquisition of and use of commercial technologies like quadcopters or FPV drones, they're talking about volunteers. Russian state media now officially recognizes that most of the quadcopters flying today in Russian service are in fact donated by volunteers, and all FPV type racing kamikaze drones are also donated by volunteers. So the volunteers are actually a very significant contribution to the official Russian military war effort, whether or not it's recognized officially by the Ministry of Defense or the government or some of its elements. But really, it isn't just about this volunteer effort that kind of pushed me to this conversation. I think we're talking about a convergence of three very important factors here. Number one is the development and rise of commercial technology that far outpaces any of the technologies which are developed by the military or government, not just Russian. But I think world over, across all of the major militaries, there are issues with trying to acquire or connect with or integrate some type of commercial technology which kind of raced way, way ahead of what the official military or even government plans were. United States is, it's not an exception here. There are lots of efforts, DoD, for example, Department of Defense, trying to integrate commercial technology, and there are even enterprises and initiatives stood up like the Defense Innovation Unit, which are designed to connect with the commercial and the private sector. And so across the world right now, there's a lot of commercial developments which are finding their way to the military and to the war. The second important topic here are absolutely massive acquisition issues that any major military has with trying to acquire and integrate this commercial technology. And again, this kind of goes back to the point I just made about some of the official policies and initiatives within government, certainly within, for example, the United States, trying to facilitate and speed up the acquisition of necessary commercial technology. And in the United States, for example, it has a lot to do with artificial intelligence and drone warfare and other very breakthrough and far-reaching technologies. And then finally, the third kind of major issue here is the rise of platforms that make all of this extremely public. And by that, I mean the Telegram channels, which have multiplied by the hundreds right now. Channels that belong to specific Russian volunteer groups and organizations. Channels that belong to, for example, specific Russian military units, to Russian military formations, or to anybody who wants to participate in, assist, and help the Russian military war effort. So it is the convergence of those three important topics: the rise of commercial technologies, the acquisition issues experienced by major militaries around the world, and especially Russia, as well as the rise of social media platforms that make all of that public. And this kind of goes or rather feeds into the narrative of how Russian volunteers get their technology, get their quadcopters, get their drones to specific Russian military units, to soldiers, and how all of that actually takes place.
So having followed you for quite a while, I often see you post about some of the major, perhaps semi-official or quasi-official organizations that are doing this kind of a work. So, we will get to some of those smaller groups that you mentioned are just crowdfunding on Telegram, but there are some huge organizations, including Prigozhin having developed his tech center, or Rogozin's Tsar's Wolves and Project Archangel. Could you just tell us a little bit about the bigger initiatives that are ongoing and where you think they fit in the environment?
Absolutely. So again, the reason behind the rise of these large, medium, and small sized or small scale volunteer efforts are very serious issues that have now been exposed and are experienced still by the Russian military, and especially the gaps that the Russian military has basically experienced for well over a year now. And a lot of these volunteer efforts are basically delivering supplies, they're delivering technologies, which the Russian military should have provided. So all in all, the top line efforts by these volunteer groups deal with the provision, acquisition, and delivery of different types of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, to the Russian military units at the front. And a lot of these efforts involve commercial type quadcopters like DJI and Autel purchased from China, as well as the development of different types of FPV drones, and also the delivery of, for example, thermal imagers, night vision scopes, delivery of anything from, let's say, generators to thermal underwear to vehicles and cars, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that, of course, is enabled by Telegram. So the biggest effort so far, the largest in scale and probably the ones with most financial backing, belong to, first of all, Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group. They've opened a Wagner Center in St. Petersburg, which is a large multi-story modern-looking office building, which is supposed to be kind of like their R&D center where they can investigate, develop, and sort of work on different types of technologies, including UAVs and drones. Wagner Center even held a hackathon for drone operators on how to evade adversarial electronic warfare. And so there are videos online posted about some of the technologies developed inside Wagner Center. Of course, a lot of these have to do with small UAVs that the Russian military so desperately needs. Another large-scale effort, again, probably by scale and financial backing, is Dmitry Rogozin's. He's the former head of Roscosmos, or space agencies. His organization, which he very proudly called Tsar's Wolves, harkening back to the pre-revolutionary sort of effort to support the Tsar, to support the empire, to fight on behalf of the Russian Empire. And Tsar's Wolves is supposed to, again, facilitate the flow of different types of self-initiated technologies to the Russian soldiers and to the fighters in the Donbass, to the Donetsk and Lugansk malicious. And some of these are self-initiated. Some of these are commercially purchased. But Tsar's Wolves now kind of taken center stage, at least publicly, as an organization, as a non-government, meaning an organization that's not part of the official government structure, that can develop and facilitate the flow of these technologies. Its biggest and most public effort is the one I wrote about on Twitter, and that has to do with the testing and evaluation of one of the few Russian combat unmanned ground vehicles, the Marker, which Dmitry Rogozin and his initiative are supposed to be testing in the Donbass. And the third effort, which again we can review by size and scale, is called VECHE, which is a nonprofit organization which is nationwide, which has collected millions and millions of rubles to purchase all manner of equipment, with drones being on top of the list, and then going down the list, everything from the stuff that soldiers need on a daily basis to technologies they need to fight, as well as vehicles and other transportation items. Those are kind of like the three large efforts which are constantly popping up on Russian language telegrams.
And so these largest efforts, particularly Prigozhin's and Rogozin's, it seems like they're more than just crowdsourcing. In that I know Rogozin has a training program for drone pilots as well, and I think they both have research arms. How significant is the crowdfunding effort to what they do? Is it just a piece?
Well, for these particular organizations, what they are working with specifically are people, initiatives, companies, and developments that already have ready products. So there's a lot of outcry on Russian language telegram about Russian-born, Russian-made technical solutions which aren't making their way to the front because of the extensive bureaucracy within the Ministry of Defense. And so both Wagner and Rogozin's Tsar's Wolves are trying to kind of take these developments, these self-initiated projects which already exist, for example, a drone, a quadcopter, an FPV drone, and test it out. VECHE and other smaller organizations that we can get to actually rely on crowdsourcing. They rely on people sending money to their specific efforts so that they can purchase equipment. And what's interesting about Telegram as a platform that enables it all is that the posts by these volunteer groups, individuals, organizations usually list the requirements, meaning we are shopping for, and then there's a list. And then they give a bank card number where you can transfer your money to. In fact, last year there was even a cryptocurrency link where you could transfer some of that money via cryptocurrency. That's gone now. So usually it's a bank card from Sberbank, which is Russia's biggest bank, and you can donate to that particular effort, to that particular fundraising using your own funding. And this kind of reaches, I guess this has a global reach. Anybody with access to Telegram and knowledge of the Russian language can understand and can read and can kind of see these requirements. And so this is obviously directed at the Russian population in Russia proper, perhaps in the near abroad. And people have donated. People have raised, or people have donated so much that these organizations are claiming to have raised enormous amounts of money. Let me get to some of the several smaller organizations, which probably we should probably discuss. One of the most active and most accurate and most reliable Telegram channels is called Dva Mayora, or Two Majors. And the Two Majors Telegram channel have been very prolific in advertising different types of fundraising for the Russian military war effort. They actually have a separate effort where they are raising money from, or crowdsourcing money, to develop different types of FPV drones and actually test them out. Another public effort on a smaller scale, but still significant, is called Katya Valia DNR. And these are two sisters, Catherine and Valentina, who were born in Donetsk, and they're actually raising money. They're crowdsourcing the purchase of and development of quadcopters, FPV drones, uniforms, and other equipment. And they're actually very successful in raising large sums of money to purchase large quantities of this type of military equipment. Of course, I mentioned VECHE, but there are other sort of smaller efforts out there. Project Archangel is another Telegram channel and an effort that specifically develops and builds and tests different types of UAVs. Right now, everyone is building FPV type of drones, because that has emerged as the single sort of most successful UAV model for both sides, not just the Russians, Ukrainians as well, where FPV drones could be built on a very small cost, like very cheaply, for example, less than $1,500, and be piloted by an operator who was taken maybe 3 weeks or so to train. And FPV drones can actually destroy equipment, armored vehicles, tanks that cost many magnitudes more than the FPV drone itself. And all of the efforts that I have described, they all not only have their own sort of purchasing and acquisition pipelines, supply chains, but a lot of these actually have their own testing and development efforts. They are now into training FPV pilots. They are building bases and test centers where they can test different types of military technologies, with drones and FPVs being at the top of the list.
So given that both the larger organizations and even some of these smaller Telegram-based ones are pursuing training and testing of innovations, has it seemed like any of these groups have come up with any innovations that have improved things on the front? Are they having an effect, or is it more aspirational at this point?
Well, I think if we kind of look at all of these efforts together right now, the biggest effort, both again by the Russian military, by the Russian volunteers, as well as their Ukrainian counterparts, is building and delivering a lot of FPV drones to the warfighter in the hundreds and in the thousands. And the side that can build more and deliver them faster and train pilots faster has an edge. And right now, Russian military and Russian commentators are concerned that Ukraine actually has an edge, because Ukrainian volunteer effort, United 24, as well as its counterpart called Brave, not only has built a lot of drones that have been delivered to the Ukrainian soldiers, but Ukrainians claim to have trained 10,000 drone pilots. And Russians are kind of far behind the curve, but they are trying to match Ukrainians in those efforts. So again, the biggest issue right now is training FPV pilots, because it takes 3 weeks. Making sure that these pilots can undergo all the necessary testing. So you have to have a testing range of some kind, and then deliver that technology to the front. And now on Telegram, you get more and more pictures every day of kind of people standing in front of, let's say, stacks of hundreds or even thousands of FPV drones that are going to the front. That's probably going to be the most noticeable effort right now, because that's what grabs most attention on social media. Just as important is the volunteer-funded, the crowd-funded effort to deliver other supplies to the front. And I've already mentioned some of the technical supplies like thermal imagers, laser rangefinders, sniper scopes, and clothing, food items, cars, vans, 4x4 trucks, the pickup trucks, which are used very widely across the front and used by both sides. So is that having a noticeable effect? In some parts of the front, it does. For that specific Russian unit, for example, or a unit from the Donbass that has received that technology which they so desperately need, it's going to make a difference. Whether it makes a difference for 24 hours or whether it makes a difference for 24 days remains to be seen, but it also depends on what exactly is delivered, because quadcopters and FPV drones have a very short shelf life. Other technologies and other supplies that are delivered can have a much longer shelf life and a much greater effect on the fight.
There are lots of dynamics there. And so just a reminder, because the crowd has grown, that we're chatting with Sam Bendet about the development of crowdfunding networks in Russia. And because Sam's time is limited, we're just going with an interview format. We had a couple of people request to speak, but if you have any questions, please do DM them to myself or to one of my co-hosts, and we'll try and work them into the conversation. Exit, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
So, Sam, a number of the threads that you've posted have mentioned that Russian MOD testing of weapons is kind of a hindrance to the development cycle. Are these volunteers groups kind of participating with the MOD at all, or are they just completely outside it?
That's a great question. It's not always clear whether people who complain about those issues are actually well integrated with or are completely outside of the MOD sort of development and acquisition cycle. Some of the larger initiatives, for example, Dmitry Rogozin's initiative, claims to be better integrated with the MOD and cooperate with the Ministry of Defense on acquiring and supplying certain technologies to the front, bypassing the onerous and lengthy MOD paperwork or acquisition life cycles, et cetera. Some of the smaller efforts do not have that capacity. So what they do is they just ship that technology directly to the front. And this is where they think they can be most successful. As I've already mentioned, it can make a difference for a specific unit that gains a quadcopter for, let's say, just a few days' time, because that particular quadcopter is an essential intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance element that can make a difference between life and death for the soldiers in that unit. Some of the other technology, which is, or rather other supplies which are delivered, again, usually flow directly to the warfighters, whether they're in the military or in the Donbass. And sometimes the government gets in its own way. Following the May 9th attack, the Russian government has instituted counter-UAS and UAV patrols. There's now sort of an effort across the police to locate the people who fly drones illegally, and that can also lead to the seizures of quadcopters that people have in their possession. This can also impact significantly the delivery of quadcopters, for example, across Russia to the front, to the Ukrainian border. A couple of months ago, there were issues with Russian border patrol between Russia and China, and the border patrol officers were confiscating quadcopters, which were purchased by the volunteers and bound for the units fighting in the Ukraine. And because those acquisitions, because those purchases don't have the same paperwork as the MOD, the government sometimes is at a loss whether this is a sort of a purchase to be used inside Russia or a purchase that's heading sort of towards the soldiers via volunteers. Volunteers claim to have resolved a lot of these issues with the Russian Customs and Border Patrol, but it's not exactly clear whether the MOD is just ignoring this because it's convenient, or it's ignoring it because it can't really do much about it. But one thing is clear: all of these volunteers, all of these Telegram channels are basically saying that the MOD acquisition pipelines are too lengthy, too bureaucratic, take too long of a time, and too cumbersome right now to deliver much needed technologies very quickly. And the best solution right now is to go through a privately funded effort, a crowdsourced effort, and through volunteers who can literally place a specific technology or a supply item directly in the hands of the fighters that need it the most, which is why there's such a proliferation right now on Telegram of different channels about the Russian warfighting effort. And some of the Russian units actually have their own Telegram channels, and they can raise specific funds or they can sort of ask for supplies to be delivered by volunteers for a very specific mission and for a very specific cause.
You made reference there to the customs issues, particularly importing parts from China. I know that some of the major Chinese manufacturers have adopted a policy of not selling to either Ukraine or Russia, I think particularly DJI. But are you seeing that these private efforts, are they mainly purchasing parts from China and abroad? Because sometimes Russia will talk a big game about having a domestic manufacturing industry that's developing. Are they able to manufacture anything themselves, or are they still primarily reliant on China?
I think they're still relying on China. The biggest acquisition item on top of every volunteer list are DJI quadcopters that have become the go-to UAV in this war, not just for the Russians, but also for the Ukrainians as well. Another sort of item at the top of the list are parts needed to assemble an FPV drone, an FPV racing drone. And most of these parts also come from China, basically from AliExpress. Because these are purely commercial technologies and commercial items, even official statements about not selling something officially for, on behalf of or for the Russian military or for the Ukrainian military for that matter, are really not having an effect on the speed of and the volume of acquisition, because these are commercial technologies. If they cannot be purchased on AliExpress, they can be purchased on other online platforms or maybe even physical marketplaces. And so there are directions for many volunteers and for many people who want to donate certain items, where to get certain things, including where to get quadcopters if they can't purchase it officially on AliExpress. DJI has become so dominant around the world in manufacturing and selling their easy to use, easy to operate drone that they meaning these drones are available for purchase in the many tens of thousands a month probably. And so far, the Russian volunteers are not having any significant issues with acquiring DJI Mavic drones or Autel drones. And they're not having any significant issue with acquiring parts to assemble many FPV type drones. You have mentioned Russian defense industry. There were a couple of very public scandals last year when the Russian defense industry, one specific company, the Almaz-Antey, has revealed its own military quadcopter that it pledged to build in the many thousands to send to the front. But the Russian commentators on Telegram quickly pointed out that the quadcopter displayed by Almaz-Antey was actually a Chinese racing drone. And so this created a very public scandal, and Almaz-Antey basically had to issue a mea culpa saying, okay, this was in fact a partially assembled Chinese quadcopter, which had some Russian parts. And really, Russia doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. It can just copy available technologies and kind of build them at volume. There's yet to be any evidence that large Russian defense enterprises are building these quadcopters or FPV drones at scale. There is evidence that the volunteers are building these FPV drones basically in their homes, in their garages, on their own free time, using their own money. But there is no evidence yet that the Russian defense industrial sector is sort of shifting towards manufacture and delivery of these much needed, cheap and expendable technologies to the front.
Well, thanks for that. When you talk about people purchasing and assembling these on their own, I know that after the strikes, the increasing strikes in Russia that have been attributed to the Ukrainians, several Russian regions have implemented drone bans. Have you gotten any indication that those bans might interfere with the ability of crowdsourcing efforts to, test product, whether it's test innovation in product or just assemble them and ensure that they work?
They might actually, and this is what we discussed on Friday with Fane Greenwood, who is my counterpart dealing with commercial drone technologies. And the Russian laws basically passed to prevent any unauthorized drone flights following the May 9th attack on the Kremlin are actually having a detrimental effect on the entire Russian drone industry. And there's a lot of complaints from that industry about massive prohibitions on flying these drones, especially testing these drones across many Russian regions. But this is where this kind of diverges from the larger issue experienced by the Russian domestic drone industry, is that a lot of testing and evaluation can actually now take place in Russian-occupied Donbass and Russian-occupied Ukraine. And so a lot of these efforts, especially Rogozin's effort, for example, or the two majors effort, they don't have to take place in Russia. They can actually take place, especially when it comes to drone testing, they can take place in eastern or southern Ukraine.
So, Sam, when I was looking at your thread on the Wagner Center, there was a number of pictures of agricultural drones, which interest me specifically because I like farming. Is that something that we're actually seeing them use at the front? And are the agricultural sanctions hurting the ability to get those drones into Russia?
It's a great question. In fact, a lot of the larger, heavier agricultural drones, which are manufactured by DJI and other companies, are very much in demand across the front, both in Russian and Ukrainian service, because they can carry more weight, they can carry more cargo, and therefore they can carry more munitions, bombs, etc., and grenades. So there is an effort to acquire these. It doesn't happen on the same scale and volume as, for example, acquisition of smaller, lighter DJI Mavic 2s and 3s and Pros and others. But it does happen, and it's very much a desired product. Ukrainians have, again, become more flexible and more successful in fielding large number of these agriculture-type drones against the Russian forces. And the Russians are now kind of trying to copy that successful concept and tactic in doing the same. Some of these efforts are actually assembling agricultural type drones in Russia proper to be sent to the front, again, and on a much smaller scale than what Ukraine has right now. But though some of these big drones, in fact, flown by Ukrainians are called by, actually have a nickname across the Russian services, they call them Baba Yaga, which is the Eastern European term for a forest witch. And these Baba Yagas are actually quite dangerous to the Russian forces because they can drop a lot of munitions on top of the Russian heads. So there is an effort to acquire that. There's an effort to assemble that, but on a much smaller scale than what is taking place in Ukraine.
There, of course, there's been a lot of attention paid to Iranian drones. There has been talk about the potential to build an assembly plant within Russia. I also saw a reference to the possibility of an assembly plant in Belarus. There was also word that Wagner may have been reaching out directly, potentially to North Korea or China, even aside from the Ministry of Defense. When it comes to the fixed-wing drones, are there any crowdfunding efforts that are purchasing those? Would any private money be involved in the in assembly plants?
I think so. Again, looking at what is discussed on Telegram, what is talked about in the Russian media, there's also an effort to build fixed-wing aircraft type drones. And for example, both Dmitry Rogozin and the Wagner Center are supposedly involved in this type of development and delivery effort. Some of the drones used by both sides, but mostly by Ukrainians right now, are actually commercial aircraft type drones. One that has become very dangerous for the Russians in the Crimea and Russia proper is the Chinese-made Mugin 5 drone. And that's a commercial fixed-wing drone, which could be purchased anywhere between $10,000 and $15,000, could be modified to carry different types of weights and cargoes. This particular drone has a range of several hundred kilometers. And so it has become one of the drones that Ukraine used very successfully against Russian positions. And Russians want to copy that concept and tactic. Again, one of the major points here is not to reinvent the wheel. If the adversary is already using technology with great success, and if that technology, concept, and usage tactic can be copied, then that's what the Russians are trying to do. If they can acquire technology that's already available, commercial technology that is available, dual-use technology, they will do so. If they can acquire and build a drone or assemble a drone that they can purchase readily and then use against their adversary, they will do that as well. Rogozin's effort occasionally claims to kind of try and reinvent the wheel, try to build something new, quote unquote, but a lot of commentators usually point out that what they're working with are derivatives of some of the Chinese technology, some of the Chinese drones, vertical landing and takeoff drones, variable wing drones, regular quadcopters and FPV drones. So again, there's a lot of effort by both sides to kind of use what's already available, which now includes fixed-wing aircraft, drones with longer ranges.
Well, that's very interesting. You don't hear about that as often in the press. Exit, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, so to follow up on that idea of copying what's already out there, we haven't seen a lot of Russian undersea drones. So obviously we know you mentioned that the Russian Telegram channels were commenting on Covert Shore's post about the new UUVs that Ukraine is putting out there and has announced. And then we haven't seen a whole bunch of evidence of Russia using those particular types of drones. Is that something they're working on, or is that just something they haven't caught up to yet?
Great question. Actually, before the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russian Navy claimed to have at least 17 different types of unmanned underwater and surface vehicle projects. And certainly there were a lot of claims in the Russian media about different types of USVs, unmanned surface vessel, that are already present on some Russian minesweepers. and in different fleets. And so the question about their absence is obviously very apt and on point. What happened to these projects? Why aren't they necessarily finished? Why aren't they reaching their logical conclusion and are used in Ukraine? And I don't have a good answer about that. Today I tweeted a comment from Telegram from one of the volunteers who basically said that there are self-initiated efforts that can put these unmanned surface vehicle type drones into the hands of the Russian warfighters tomorrow, but they have to be tested officially, and the MOD paperwork is rather onerous and lengthy, and so these efforts kind of languish for lack of better patrons and better supporters. And this is where Rogozin, for example, steps in, claiming that they can take these and other efforts and quickly kind of put them in the hands of the warfighter, bypassing the official MOD channels and networks. And so, yes, Russian military does have different types of maritime robotics projects. A lot of them were not finished. A lot of them were going through different types of testing and evaluation before this invasion began. Apparently, these tests have been put on hold because Russian military is putting its effort elsewhere. It's not clear what the fate of a lot of these efforts is, but the volunteers are also there, and the volunteers are building things on their own, probably in a university somewhere, in some kind of tech company or maybe even a shipping company, and they have developed a cheap, expendable, and disposable USV, which can be used, except the MOD has to test it, and apparently it is that a particular test, that is that set of policies within MOD that stifles innovation, stifles the delivery of these technologies because of the very lengthy bureaucracy that is the Russian Ministry of Defense.
So I know, Sam, that your time is limited. My last line of questioning is about, given that many of these smaller efforts have some public presence, do you know, is there an effort afoot to try to track who they are, how much they may be raising, to archive these items, whether for research or whether to use them as an effort to crack down on sanctions evasion networks? Is that work being done?
I have not seen that, and again, some of these efforts are relatively high profile. Some of them are not. Some basically are constantly on Telegram and have a daily presence and daily updates of what they're doing, how much they're raising, and what they're spending the money on. And other efforts kind of pop up and then disappear for a while, and they obviously pop up again. We also have to mention that the Russian telegrams are also warning people who donate money to be wary of scams. And apparently, because of these efforts that crowdsource funding have proliferated, so have various different types of scams where people can be scammed out of money, or even if the people who are raising certain amounts of money to purchase certain types of quadcopters don't want to scam the military or the volunteers, they end up doing so because some of the people who are working on that don't have a good idea of the technical specifications and requirements that the military needs or that the Donbas fighters want. And so there are efforts where drones are delivered, for example, which are crowdsourced, but they are not a good fit for a specific unit or a specific mission. And so there's different types of scams now in this space that the Russians are warning against. I'm not sure if the Russian military is tracking this. They probably are. This information is rather public. But also, look, it's a public effort. Sometimes it's difficult to discern exactly what has been done and what has been delivered, because we take a lot of these claims at face value. If a specific organization said that they raised several million rubles and purchased so many drones and, let's say, so many thermal imagers and have delivered them, right? Sometimes there are pictures and videos of soldiers thanking the volunteers and volunteer organizations saying, we have gotten a delivery off. We took delivery of these specific drones and these specific technologies, and these type of proofs are helpful in determining the validity of these efforts. But sometimes the delivery takes place and nothing else happens after that. But again, it would be an interesting effort to try and track all that. Obviously, would require a lot of time and money.
I'm sure it would. One benefit of meeting some of the folks in the OSINT spaces, some people have the time and determination, whether it's out of a desire to help Ukraine or they're fascinated by the subject. So that's why I like to bring up the idea of, if no one is tracking them or trying to in a comprehensive way, maybe there's scope for somebody listening to try to get started on that. Who knows what benefit it could serve, which I know we started the conversation by my asking you, what's the impact? Why did you bring this subject up? Maybe to bring it full circle, having followed the subject closely yourself, what do you think the main benefit of following the subject is? Is it insight into the power play? Is it insight into the ability of the Russian military to supply itself? What is the concrete thing at the end that you can get from tracking this particular issue?
Well, I think it's multiple things that we can understand. With the absolutely unprecedented importance of commercial type quadcopters and FPV drones in this war, we can see exactly what is needed in specific parts of the front, or even in specific units. We can see the volume of usage of some of these drones by certain formations and units as well. We can see which technology is most in demand and for what types of mission. We can also sort of see how the volunteers and essentially a non-government, non-military commercial effort has stepped up, and how influential or not influential it is in this war. If we look across the front at the Ukrainians, they've gotten a lot better than the Russians at that. And the coordination between the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military, Ukrainian defense industrial sector, Ukrainian high-tech sector, and the Ukrainian volunteers who build certain types of technologies, coordinate amongst themselves, and deliver needed technologies to the front is an envy of the Russian military, who want to emulate that, but cannot at this point, and may not even do so in the near future, because of the way the Ministry of Defense and the Russian defense industrial sector works. The reason why, for example, a lot of these defense industrial enterprises don't want to shift to producing cheap, expendable military technologies such as FPV drones is because they want to build military type FPV drones like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms and larger combat UAV platforms that not only have a more expensive price tag, but can survive a lot longer than an FPV drone. And so they want to build something that lasts, and obviously it's going to be a more expensive undertaking. So there's a lot of overlapping issues here. Almost all of them are leading up to the MOD with questions about how the Russian Ministry of Defense is handling the war, how it's handling the supply chains, how it's handling the acquisition, and the recognition that certain types of technologies like commercial type drones are so pivotal and are so readily available that even regular people, regular babushkas in Russia can raise money for, can purchase those to the front and deliver those in the hands of the actual warfighter.
In many ways, it's fascinating that so much potentially important information on development of both processes and the technology is just being put out there publicly. And the economist in me makes me want to think about whether the funds raised from these crowdfunding efforts justify the information disclosure that they're putting up to justify the initiative, as in perhaps it might be better to raise slightly less money but give away less operational secrets. But I'm sure there will be lots of analysis of that, questions like that done after the war. So Sam, I know that you have only a few minutes left. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming to speak with us. The time flew by, and we appreciate your expertise. And hopefully you had a good enough time that you would be open to coming back and chatting with us again at some point in the future.
I absolutely will. And thank you for having me on your podcast, and always happy to speak on this and to kind of shed light on some of the corners of this narrative that may not necessarily get a lot of coverage.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And so because Sam had limited time, we weren't taking questions, but if anything that you heard Sam speak about is something that you wanted to comment on, or it inspired you, we will have a bit of a chat about it. But to that end, a friend of ours, Constantine, has been kind enough to join us. We wanted to, having raised some of these issues of crowdfunding in the Russian context, we were hoping to get just a little bit of insight into similar crowdfunding efforts on the Ukrainian side. And Constantine has been well known for his dedication to raising funds, particularly for the purchase of drones. And so, Constantine, thanks very much for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, as we ask you questions, I understand you might not be able to discuss some things in detail. For those who are listening and might not be familiar with your effort, could you just give us a quick summary of the effort you've been putting in to raise funds?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a volunteer for Liberty Ukraine Foundation. It's a United States-based nonprofit, tax deductible. We are working on fundraising money for the drones for Ukrainian military. They're used for we provide them for evacuation purposes, and surveillance. And we're doing those efforts all the time. Right now, we're running, for example, we have a tour with a Ukrainian famous band called Okeanerze. The tour is in the United States. We fundraised $250,000, $225,000 at this moment during this tour. Also, we constantly fundraise on Twitter as well. Then we're purchasing these commercial drones, non-lethal. We're not buying FPV drones, obviously, because it would be not a humanitarian aid. They're used for a little bit different purposes, which I absolutely like, but it's not what we do. And we're buying mostly DJIs. It's, like Sam has said, we're working with DJI. We're not working with DJI directly, obviously. But we're buying DJI drones, and we're buying Autel drones. And recently I have an initiative to purchase Ukrainian-made alternative fixed-wing drones, but they are supposed to be much more EW resistant. They should be able to not to be lost as easy as DJIs, because each unit can use up to 10 DJI drones a day of the active combat. But once again, that's like $20,000, and if you manage to save even one life, spending $20,000, that's a win. So we're still happy for that. But Ukrainian fixed-wing drones appear to be more EW, electronic warfare resistant, much more resistant to the jamming. So we're looking into that right now, but because they are not producing such huge quantities as DJI does, they're much more expensive. So that's gist of what we're doing. We're working with all across Ukrainian brigades, not only like one brigade. I'm working personally with 46, 92nd Brigade, 81st. 26 brigades, and you must understand each brigade is anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 people, so those are huge units, and even get enough drones for one unit, like to completely supply them, takes it's going to be $1 million. So we just trying to give a bit here, a bit there, and there are a lot of other efforts that doing this as well, and together we manage to. You see the results on the battlefield, obviously. I hope that summarized a bit what we're doing. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great background. I've often heard you speak about your initiative, but never sort of a comprehensive explanation. And the fact that you guys are looking at domestically produced fixed wing is fascinating. I hadn't heard that before either. Exit, you have a question. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So based on what we heard from Sam about Russian volunteer units working kind of outside the MOD for a lot of their things, do you work within the MOD structure to do any of the things you do, or is this all kind of external and just helping outside that process?
So me personally, no, I'm not working with MOD in any way. I know people who are there, but we don't work together. But I know that the Liberty Foundation as a fund, it's a bigger organization. We do work. There are some efforts to coordinate UAV deliveries. So I know we get help from them. That sometimes they may ask us for something, probably, but it's not what I do. So this is what I said is I think pretty much everything we can talk about at this moment. So we do have some cooperation, but I'm not really competent in talking about that. I am more working with specific units that I worked with, that I know since I was in the Ukrainian military myself. And when the war started, obviously we all connected, we all spoke, and right now helping them to make sure that they all, save lives of. It's not an exaggeration when I'm saying drones save lives. It's such. It's true. It just drones do save lives. And if you manage to spot upcoming Russian offensive and can react, it's just one spotting of in time. In seeing this offensive in time will be so. Like it will save at least 1 or 2, 3 lives, because I know too many occurrent events when we did not manage to see them incoming early enough, and it resulted in dead people being killed. So we're not exaggerating when we're talking about saving lives. And when we look at those drones dropping bombs, that's one thing, but it's far we don't give drones for that. And it's just one small thing that the drones do. The surveillance is super important, and surveillance is what is where the key value of those drones are. Not dropping munitions, but dropping munitions, of course, is important for the war efforts as well. I'm not saying it's not important, just saying that surveillance and reconnaissance is the key here.
Well, and it strikes me that there are so many different initiatives that it's certainly possible for your group to focus on recon and others to raise funds for other purposes. Exit, did you have a follow-up?
Mine was a totally different question, so maybe I'll let Jacoby go first because I've had lots of questions already.
Yeah, sure. Jacoby, please go ahead.
Why don't we let Aaron go ahead? He's been waiting a little bit, and I'll come back around. Thanks.
Sure. Aaron.
Hey, guys, thanks. So with Constantine, with your drones now, are you have you gotten much support from Canada, or is it you're focused on more worldwide, like funding online, or is it I'm just wondering on how I know everybody does it differently. I mean, it's all directly online, and then but I mean through different organizations. I don't know if you can network it through different organizations as well. For I know that different aid organizations help with different. It's all like in a connection with different things. But yeah, thanks, Aaron. Guys, who don't know me, Aaron Balma. I'm host of the Balma Report, Military and Ocean Space. Thanks.
So I will speak on my behalf, not entire organization, because I'm just volunteer there. I'm working with online only. It's and basically you guys is everything that I have, and I rely on your support. That's about it. I have a couple of friends. I have a couple of we have a couple of organizations that reached out, but this is businesses who donate. And they do it themselves, but they found me and the work over Twitter. So everything I have is you, and you've been great so far. And I think that's where, in the context of what Sam was talking about when he spoke regarding Russian volunteer efforts and donations This is where we can do much more and be better than them, because we are a world, entire world on Twitter, and on social networks, and we are much bigger than them, and we can help much more. So we depend on people on social network, and in all the combined people in the free world can do much more than Russian volunteers. Just want to say that.
I think that's a powerful thought. Jacoby, go ahead.
Hi, Konstantin. I was wondering about the kind of products that you crowdsource, and whether you aim for locally produced machines that Ukrainians have been very innovative in showing a lot of innovation in making, or if you tend to look outside the country to China, to even to neighboring countries. Poland has really raised their game, and even not so friendly countries that may be producing equipment, the enemy of your enemy is your friend kind of thing. And if you have the resources to do that, whether it's just parts or it's actual machines, what you all look for, or if you mainly focus your attention on the US.
So I'm not sure that I understood the question. I will try to answer. We're working mostly with DJI and Autel drones. That's our focus. That is China. They don't have pretty much any alternatives. Like I've said, there are Ukrainian alternatives that are coming in, but those are fixed wings. The price tag is totally different. It's absolutely totally different for proper fixed wing aircraft that can withstand the electronic warfare and jamming. And you must understand that we don't have a sponsor that give us $3 million and then we can configure something out. My efforts rely on just average people who drop $50 here, $10 there, and we can afford usually DJI drones, that DJI and Autel drones. I've tried efforts. I've tried to get some other drones produced by other manufacturers, but they are not as close as quality. Unfortunate reality is that DJI in China has stepped up commercial UAV drones to such higher level than that the United States simply cannot. Neither United States nor Europe can compete. There are some alternatives, but they cost like 3 times more. Some of them were tried, and people said, "Well, this is some kind of wonder weapon, wonder drone that is hard to use, hard to understand. There are hard to find parts. Parts are more expensive than the drones themselves. The interface of using it is complex to understand, and they are lost just as easily as DJI." So when someone is asking me, "Okay, why don't you buy this 1 American drones?" Well, I will buy 5 Chinese drones. And even though you're saying, "Oh, I'm supporting the Chinese economy," I'm sorry, but I'm saving Ukrainian lives. I'm not here to support Chinese economy, and I think that United States does not have laws that prohibit buying from China, and the United States, like everything that we buy, is almost from China in the United States. So that's the reality in which and during the war, I don't have much choices. I buy what is needed to save lives. That's why we focus on that. But every day I'm looking for other solutions, because these DJI drones, they are lost so quick. Like I've said, some units can lose 10 of them when the combat is very intense. So we're trying to looking for solutions, and one of them is Ukrainian. But once again, the tag on that effort is $200,000. I'm not sure I'm going to try it. I want to try it, but it's just the top I fundraised so far was $110,000 in one go. It took 3 weeks or 2 weeks, I don't remember exactly, but it was successful. But it was hard, and now we're gonna step it twice that. I'm not sure it's gonna work, but I know I probably gonna try it, but I cannot guarantee anything yet.
For my own curiosity, in order to make a decision like that, to put in that much work, save up that much money, would a drone like that already be in use with other units so that you would be very confident that it would meet the needs of the units that you work with? Or is there still a little bit of the unknown when you have to make that decision?
I would say there are two ways how to look into it. One of them is there is a smaller drone called that we're looking in is the Shark Mini. It's Ukrainian produced fixed wing drone called Shark Mini. It's really compact. It's small, and it was tested. It was one of the units that I know. They are happy with it, but that's basically it. There is another one that is called Shark, just full-size Shark, let's say. It's bigger, it's more stable, and it's been produced for quite some time right now. And there are units that use them and work with them, and they were really happy about it. They said it's absolutely great, like stabilization. It's great against jamming, and it worked, and they were super happy. But as the bigger one, it costs more, so we will get only one system if we try, versus getting 3 smaller ones. So it's basically for me more like choosing, okay, we're gonna go with smaller ones for infantry units, or we're gonna go for a bigger one for more higher level organization of the unit. So it allows them to have better capabilities.
I'm sure those are difficult issues to balance. Exit, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So this is a question I ask often, and I actually put something up in the nest that relates to it, but I haven't been able to read it yet today. But Konstantin, so when you were over in Ukraine fighting versus now, there's, to my understanding, and please correct me if I am wrong, there's more use of drones to gather information. That information obviously changes how battles are fought. What are the major changes that have happened given that extra information that's available now versus maybe when you were over there?
I'm not sure that I understood the question. If you talk about difference between using drones now and then, the differences are very huge. I mean, it's not even you cannot compare. If you ask why, it's simply because in 2014, 2015, commercial drones were just, it was probably a year, I think, when DJI Phantom came out, which was actually first easy to use UAV. Everything else before was something that it was really, you got to be a drone enthusiast, you got to be professional, special training, know everything about UAVs, and there were obviously parts problems and etc. So it was like a very niche thing. What changed right now is that because of the DJI investment and development of commercial drones in general all over the world, it's just something that you can buy. You can do it right now. You can buy off the shelf of any store. It's going to cost you like $2,000, $3,000, but it's nothing super expensive, right? $2,000 you can people can afford it. Even in Ukraine, we can chip in and volunteer, get those money. And also, another thing that has changed is that those drones became easy to use. It's basically you pull it out of the box, you pull out the wings and the propellers out, and that's it. It can fly. The child is gonna be able to fly it. There is no of course, there are some caveats, some tricks that you will learn as you work with it because of the jamming and because of just experience. But in general, it's just you pick it up, take it out of the box, you fly it. And that's what changed. This what really changed the battlefield, because they became cheap, available, and easy to use. Those three things. And when I was there, there were some groups that were working on UAVs, but it was more like some kind of, I don't know, magic sorcery that no one understood how it's working. So we only heard of it, and that's that. But of course, there were non-commercial drones like Orlan. They had Orlans as well. We shut them down. There were. Ukraine we have built Leleka drone, which is absolutely amazing drone, a fixed wing drone that works. It just delivers, but it has, I tried to order it, it has like 6 months backlog on their production lines. They're so busy. There was smaller Furia drone, which is good as well. It's cheaper. There is also a huge backlog on it right now. But those are fixed wing drones, and they were like for special forces, like enthusiasts, and it was really, you would have to go through trainings to do this. Right now with DJI drones, pretty much all the training that you need is like someone will tell you, okay, spend 1 day getting used to it, and then during jamming you try to do this, during that you try to do that. That's all the training that you need to use it. The rest you will get with your experience. That's pretty much it. Of course, there are some things, the additional things that I cannot talk about, but it's not that like it's all like jet fighter pilot training. It's just, okay, spend an extra day over there, and that's basically it. With FPV drones, it's a bit harder, because the control of them requires a lot of actual, like, how you say this, like muscle memory, basically, that you would get used to it. You cannot just start using it because they're really fast. You have to aim with them. With surveillance drones, you just hover, so it's much easier. It's really much easier to use them. But even with FPV drones right now, there is you can go to a gaming platform called Steam. You can download it, FPV drone simulator, and it's really similar to actual drone flying. I know our units use it a lot. After that, it will take them 4 days of training to get used to it. So they say it's 9 days of training in Steam, and then 3 days on the real drone.
Exit, did you want to follow up?
I just wanted to, so that kind of answered about half of my question. The other side of that was that now that you have more drones and you can gather more information, how does that change decisions that are made on the battlefield?
Oh, gotcha. I got it. Yeah. So it changes obviously a lot. Before you only had eyes of the people, so you could only know what's happening with actually people, someone sitting in the tree line, someone looking there. So first of all, it's going to save those reconnaissance platoons' lives. You don't need to send them into the tree line where they're going to die and into the unknown. You can send there a drone. So that's one of the changes. Another change is, of course, the information. If you have more information, obviously you can react much faster. As an example, one of our drones, Svatova, in the winter, there was an attack, 2 tanks, 3 BMPs with infantry on top of them. It's a big, it's almost entire company of people with 2 tanks. There was an attack. Our drone saw it. Our artillery and mortar started firing on them. They just turned all around and left. No one was hurt, but that's an example how, thanks to the drone, it changed the battlefield. It literally stopped them. They went away. They did not want to attack anymore because they understood that they were spotted. So that's one of the key things, how it saves lives. It gives you instant, like not instant. It gives you like an early warning system. Basically, that's one of the things they changed. Of course, there are a million other ways, like how to use it. You can search for Russians. You can search for their equipment. You can search for their operations and be basically proactive other than reactive. And that's when you can strike first. And of course, they do play a great role in search and rescue operations. People. It's not being talked about a lot because people prefer to see videos where groups of Russians are being targeted by artillery. No one really looks at the videos where you have a drone spotted some civilians, dropped them a sign to follow the drone, and they evacuated. There was a recently documentary released about such an event. Then there was my friend Artyom, he's on Twitter as well, by the way. They evacuated two civilians. They spotted them just walking across the minefield in active engagement area. They took the drone. They dropped the sign for them. They followed the drone. They could evacuate them. Another impact that's not discussed. And we've seen recently how you can use the drones to help surrender, like to save Russian soldiers' lives. I know it sounds funny, but it happened. Once again, that was in my friend's unit. He was attached to it. It's not his constant unit. He was attached to it. They saw a Russian soldier who was willing to surrender. They dropped the sign to him, followed the drone. He followed the drone. He's safely alive right now. Same event happened, I think, 4 or 5 months ago. It's the same event that was documented. People don't know that it's only a certain percentage of the drone footage that we see online. There are terabytes of it that drone operators have. Which simply they don't have capacity to go through to find something, and I don't have other volunteers don't have the capacity to go through it because most of it is not like if I posted online, it's just gonna be 15 soldiers walking along the tree line 2 kilometers away like a small dots. For us, it means it's just what is interesting on that. You will not. There will not be any engagement, and for example, on Twitter, this is just gonna go down in the feed, and it will have like 3,000, 4,000 impressions. That basically means how many times people saw it actually. So no one will see it, not because it's a bad video, but because simply people don't find it interesting, and a lot of that footage. It's being tossed away, but that footage is actually presented the actionable items for commanders on the ground. Then if said, okay, we have enemy moving over there, or alternatively, we have friendlies over there, which will save because communication between the units, between friendly units is very important. And friendly fire accidents has been reduced greatly with the introduction of the drones as well. This is one of the most important things that it doesn't usually come to mind to most of the people because we all want to see Russian soldiers leaving Ukraine and everyone focuses on them, but on those videos. But there are a lot of others that is not as hyped, but quite as important, as much as important in terms of effect on the battlefield. I hope that answers.
It does, and there was a lot of detail in there, including the friendly fire question, which I think is an important one that gets overlooked. Jacoby, you have your hand up. Did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to interrupt the questions for just 1 second for a little housekeeping and remind everybody, if you're appreciating the space and the conversation that we've had with Sam and the conversation that we're still having with Konstantin for a few more minutes, and you'd like to have some of your followers see the space and take part, or you have any questions that come to mind, please retweet the space. And if you want to ask any questions, request the mic and we'll try and get you up. Thank you.
Okay. It looks like Exit may have a last question. Exit, go ahead.
I was trying to find the link, and I'm sorry I can't. But in the last couple of days, we saw some images of Ukrainians being trained to defend against drops of ammunition from drones. Is that something that I guess, is that something that is, my mind's blanking, my apologies, but is that something that you're seeing as more of a concern over the last couple months, or has it, just your thoughts on that? Sorry. I was busy trying to look for that.
There is Russian drones. They've been stepping up their drones a bit, like before. If at the beginning of the invasion, they had literally one drone per brigade or something like this. Right now, they understood that it's important, so they're learning, and it becomes a threat to us as well. But I would not say that it's really big at this moment. But once again, if you're training right, it's good to train against that. That's basically it. But it's I think you're talking about the video where with a drone dropping fake grenade on top of 3 or 4 guys advancing in the line, and they drop on the ground as a reaction on that. I would also say that it may not be exactly training against the drones. It may be just the drone is just generally simulating, unexpected attack. So the fact that it's a drone dropping something from above, it may be the training. It doesn't mean that the training is focused specifically against the drone. It may mean that anything can come from the above, and you pretty much have to have the same reaction to it. You got to drop on the ground. You got to disperse, etc.
And I did finally find that it's in the nest. Thank you, Konstantin.
Thanks for that, Exit. We've been joined by Wolverine, so we'll go for one more question, so we don't take up too much of Konstantin's time. But go ahead, Wolverine.
It was just kind of a little bit better explanation of what Konstantin talking about. So in the U.S. military, we have a drill we practice for IDF, for indirect fire, and it gets used for everything, whether it's artillery, mortars, and stuff like that. And the training like that is basically the same training what you would do. It's basically, you drop to the ground because that's the first thing, because most of the time you're safer if it's on the ground and it goes off. And then once that training is done, then you have other certain actions that you follow to get out of the area, and different things like that. So that training is actually very useful, and it can be used across, for different types of things.
And as a matter of fact, Michael, before we dismiss Konstantin, may I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Konstantin, очень приятно. Дякую для ваш service. Thank you for your service, good sir. I'm in Canada, and I would like to know how I can directly benefit and support you and the efforts of the organizations that we are associated with, type of thing. I understand one financial route, but is there something that I can apply my time and energy toward, even if that's promoting financial incursion? Do you have any thoughts about how people around the world can be more participating, and not just in a financial respect?
It's a good question. So I will. I get some of these questions asked quite often. How I can help? There are people who are willing to help a lot. But one of the things that I will tell you, like, for example, what I do specifically in Liberty Ukraine, we are like I'm gathering the funds. I will give you a high-level overview. Basically, then we have a group of volunteers in Europe that search like hounds around the Europe to find the cheapest drones. We find the company that's going to supply them. We get an invoice, we submit the payment, then we have people at the border making the documents, then we use Nova Poshta. It's like, straightforward line without anyone in between but couple of volunteers. It's that's one of the beauties of using working with drones, is that you don't need anyone almost. It's like, it's so simple. They're expensive, yet they're light, so the transportation is quite cheap. Of course, the insurance is another problem that you have to pay during the transportation, but that's basically it. I know I don't want to say anything bad about other people, but I do everything from Texas without leaving my house. We have a warehouse in Ukraine, also where my brother works. He's basically manufacturing where he gets everything, and then it's in the east. And every brigade, every unit that we work with, you just tell them, okay, here's his contact. Connect with him. He's gonna tell you when you can come pick it up. It's convenient for everyone because it's Kharkiv. It's a large logistic hub in the east. Almost every brigade goes to Kharkiv for 3 times a week. They will have someone in Kharkiv to pick it up. So it's really almost zero overhead stuff. So I don't really, and I chose this drone specifically because of this, because it has no overhead. It's not like I created this amazing network that is easy to that works because of my organization skills. No, it's because the drones are light. They're easy to transport. You just gotta have the right documents. You just gotta have the right suppliers, so you can do all that without leaving your home. But when we talk about, for example, medical supplies, those things like tourniquets, bandages, they take so much space. Or food alternative. Well, there are people who are doing food. It takes so much space, and it's compared to its price. So working with logistics companies is quite expensive. So most people and of course you need the warehouse. You don't want, for example, food to rot. And there is cooking also, and where you need volunteers. But what we do, we need help promoting the efforts, talking with others, given opportunity to collect the funds. Then that's basically it. We're trying to have as little overhead as possible, and so far I think we've been successful. I hope that answers your question, but it's really hard to help in this effort. In other efforts, I'm sure there is need, but with Ukraine, with the drones, it's mostly fundraising. I wanted to say that we're located in Austin. No secrets in that. So one of the things that we have local volunteers doing is actually running local events, and those local events generate some revenue. For example, we have pop-up markets, like people just local. That's what my wife does. She just puts signs in the local neighborhood saying that we will have a market. Whoever wants to come, just sell whatever you want there. I don't know, your old stuff, your crafts, whatever. Have fun with the locals. Have beer. Have I don't know, eat pastries. My wife cooks, 20 kilograms, 50 pounds of pastries. We put Ukrainian flag, and people just come by it, and we say that donations go to Ukraine. And just one pop-up market like that makes $1,000. And in addition to that, everyone has fun. you meet new people, and it's pretty interesting activity. We have a lot of that happening in Ukraine. Sorry, not in the Ukrainian community in Austin. One of the things how people can help, but once again, it's volunteering. It's not like just tell me. Some people come in and tell me, okay, I want to help. Tell me what can I make, where can I sell it, and how I can organize it. It's hard to manage because we all are we're not getting salaries. We 50%, 100% of our time is just our time that we spend without getting paid for it. I have a day job. All of us have the day job, so I don't have time to think it through to create some campaign for everyone. It's just people coming up with those ideas, trading, making those markets, making other ideas, making people aware, and collecting little by little. We have hundreds of people in Austin in the community that do little by little, and in the end, we can get $10,000 generated a month because of those small people. Like someone will collect $200, someone will collect $1,000, and then we will have $10,000 a month. So it's not that huge number. I mean, in social networks we can make much more, but it's just as important, and that's when actually people are doing it themselves, and that's how people can help. But I don't know how to do it in Canada. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I mean, the Pastries for Global Protection campaign sounds like a very interesting one that anybody could do, regardless of what city they're in. And I was actually in Austin 3 weeks ago. Sheesh, I wish I met you while I was there, but I will be there later on in the year, and hopefully we can connect, and just looking forward to more engagement. And thank you again, Konstantin. You are awesome. I appreciate you.
And so I'll say likewise, Konstantin, thank you very much. Having heard you speak in spaces many times just about developments in the news, I hadn't heard quite in depth a description of your efforts. And it was really interesting to hear about sort of all the calculations you go through in terms of which equipment to choose, and how to fundraise it, and that you've chosen this path with recon drones so that you can do it charitably. All of those details are interesting. I would encourage people to at least follow Konstantin, and then hopefully when he makes a decision about which type of drone to pursue next, you'll all see that, and that may help so that his wife doesn't have to bake 10,000 pounds of pastries in order to fundraise for it. And I thought that would be a nice compliment to Sam, who looked at the high level on the Russian side, to then bring in somebody who, rather than looking at it academically, is actually doing it on the Ukrainian side. So again, thank you very much, Konstantin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for great questions. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Okay. So just because the space has grown a little bit and we're at about the halfway mark, just a reminder that I hold these spaces on Sunday afternoons at 4 p.m. Eastern and Thursday evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern. And this is a space to discuss developments in the news, using lots of mainstream news, but then also bringing in open source information, whether it's analysis, investigation. And then we also try to teach some tips and techniques. And we also bring forward initiatives that people in the community are working on so that we can all collaborate. And I would put Konstantin's work, in that same idea of introducing you to a project that's ongoing so that hopefully some networking can take place. So for the second half of our conversation, we'll run through developments in the news. I had wanted to do some updates on some international matters, in particular the Turkish election, but then also touching on some developments in Pakistan and South Africa that we didn't get to on Thursday. And then hopefully we'll have about an hour to chat about developments in Ukraine. We'll get to some of the latest items, but also I'm hoping we'll have enough time to get a little into the details we sometimes overlook, including some economic questions and some developments with regard to political prisoners and espionage and the like. Before diving into that, though, on Sundays, we often have a geolocation or OSINT puzzle that Exit puts together for us. And she has an update for us this week. Exit, did you want to go ahead?
I do. So this week, nobody solved the puzzle. Even the easy one was apparently a little bit harder than I thought it would be, which is kind of interesting. I did try and mislead you in the easy one, so that's good. At least I know I'm on top of my game with that one. I would invite you. We are not going to announce a new puzzle this week. Instead, I have shared up to the nest the current puzzle, and I would invite you to solve it because it's fun. If you have problems or you're new to it, by all means, please send me a DM, ask some questions. I'm happy to lead you down the right path. There's lots of questions to be asked with this one, so definitely feel free to DM at any time, and I'll get back to you whenever I can. And what else? As always, there's always geolocations from Geo Confirmed, which I will put up in the nest as well. They've been doing some amazing work this week, geo confirming all sorts of things. Mr. Bond had highlighted one earlier in the good examples of OSINT. And if you want to try your hand at something in real life, those are a great place to start. Find something that's a couple days old that hasn't shown up on their map yet, and maybe isn't as urgent, but is still important when we're looking at the broader picture of how things go and where they're happening. And try your hand at one of those, and I'll put up the post in the nest that tells you exactly how to lay it out for them and how to tag them so that they see your work. And you never know, you might end up working with them permanently.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Normally, I don't try the puzzles out because my assumption is that there are some experts among us who solve them often while the space is still live, or they get such a head start. But knowing that it's a challenge, maybe I'll take a crack at it for the next space. So diving into updates from around the world, I wanted to start with Turkey. And before I get into it, just a reminder that part of the reason we host these spaces on Twitter is so that we can have live interaction, because we could always just record these as interviews and post them. So if you have any comments or questions from things we're discussing, please do come up, and we're happy to chat with you. So diving into developments in Turkey in particular, today is election day, and I am just putting one more thing up in the nest, which is there are reasons that the Turkish election is so important. Turkey has been playing a central role as a bit of a balancing force as between Russia and Ukraine and its allies. It has been, heavily involved in promoting the continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative because of their unique position controlling the Bosporus Straits. Turkey's position in the world also has lots of implications in that they are a NATO ally. They have approved the accession of Finland to NATO, but the accession of Sweden is still awaiting their approval. They have been engaging in some military operations into Syria, so there are many, many implications that come from the outcome of the election. To that end, last Sunday, our guest was Dr. Emre Uslu, who is a political scientist who is from Turkey, and we had a conversation with him. If you'd like some just background on who the players are and what the election process is, I'd invite you to have a look at the conversation we had last week. By way of update, So the first item in the nest, it's in Turkish, but it's really the numbers that matter, is a poll. And just so you know, if you look it up, these polls are changing minute to minute. In my notifications, some of the Turkish OSINT accounts I followed, like Yorick, or ones who are interested in it, like Oryx, they're posting that meme of hitting the F5 button for refresh because the numbers are, changing minute by minute. The current status seems to be, in order to win the presidency, a candidate would need to receive more than 50% in this round. If no candidate receives more than 50%, then there will be a second round. It was looking exceedingly close going into it. Polls were suggesting that the opposition candidate, Kılıçdaroğlu, had a lead of 2, 3, 4% over Erdogan, who is the incumbent and has been president now for, I think, just about 20 years. And however, the results so far, where I think they're talking about having about 2/3 of the ballots counted, have Erdogan in a slight lead, and that Erdogan is sitting just below 50%. Analysts have explained that because of the way the ballots are counted in population centers and often in the eastern regions of the country, the expectation is that Erdogan would jump out to a lead, and that lead may decrease as more ballots were counted. And so while Erdogan is in this particular count at 49.6%, it's not clear that he will cross 50% and win outright on this round. The second round, if it's to be held, will be 2 weeks from today on the 28th. And going into it, there was every expectation that a second round was possible. And so that seems to be how it's developing. However, looking at the second item in the nest, Timothy Ash, who is an economist, fairly well known, suggested that for the time being, this might be the worst result because it maintains uncertainty as to what will happen. And that going into the election, politicians often make promises about what they'll do when they're elected. Erdogan made several promises that were sounded extremely expensive, including raising the pay for a majority of public sector workers by something like 70%. And that might sound absurd to people who are in North America. For those who don't know, Turkey has been experiencing extremely high inflation for several years now. And so a raise of that sort is really just an attempt to keep up with inflation. However, it's not clear how Turkey's budget will hold up under pressures like that. And so with that economic impact outstanding and uncertainty for 2 weeks, it may hurt the markets. Exit, you have your hand up.
Just to further on that point, because I obviously follow it really closely, this is also, if there is a runoff, it's basically the worst possible outcome for the Black Sea Grain Initiative as well. There were meetings on Wednesday with all parties for the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Nothing really came of them other than that they would continue negotiations online. The defense minister for Turkey came out and said, we think things are going really great. We hope to have some sort of agreement very soon. And nothing has come of that. He's been very bullish on these negotiations, but most of what he said hasn't actually come to fruition until long after he has said it. And so we've also seen in the actual joint coordination center that the UN and Turkey run together, Russia has last week they stopped admitting any new ships to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. All of the ships who had been admitted and inspected had gone on to Odessa, and all but 3 of them have now left Odessa, have their cargo on board. They've left Odessa and they're on their way back to Istanbul for outbound inspections. In the meantime, they've been doing more outbound inspections than they've done in months. So they're doing 6 per day right now, which means that by the time Thursday gets here, which is the Russian imposed renewal date, they should have cleared every outbound ship, which means that there will be no ships in and no ships out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Instead of other parties having kind of some leverage on Russia, which is what happened on the very first renewal, Russia kind of, well, I guess it was right before the renewal, but Russia essentially pulled out of the deal for a couple of days, but there were still ships stuck in Odessa. And the Black Sea Grain Initiative continued to operate, and those ships left Odessa and sailed to Istanbul because they needed to get out. And it was kind of like, okay, we understand you aren't cooperating with the initiative, but the other parties are still cooperating, and we're going to continue sailing. By clearing all these ships, there won't be the option for the initiative to keep continuing on the same way that it was in that particular instance. The UN is not as likely to do inbound inspections without Russia, and that's specifically why we're seeing Russia take this tact. And so by essentially having no one in Turkey that is firmly in power, Russia is likely to hold off and kind of wait to see exactly what's happening there before they move forward. And it means that we likely will see a fairly decent stoppage in the initiative. And then it'll depend on what actually happens in the election as to whether or not there's a sense of power and control going forward that actually restarts the initiative. So this election really is pivotal to what is going on in Ukraine.
Well, that's going to make for some interesting times, both waiting on the results of the election and the results of negotiation on the grain deal. This is partly why our guest last week, Emre, we didn't book him to have him here on election day. Besides the fact that political scientists from Turkey are in insane demand on election day, we figured it was entirely possible we would not have a result. And so we will have him back on, but we'll probably wait until after the runoff, if there is a runoff. Either we'll wait a week or so and have him in once the results are clear, if there's an outright winner. If there is a runoff, then we'll have him in a week or so after the runoff, just to let the dust clear a little bit for those who might be curious to hear from him again. So just continuing on, looking at the third item in the nest is just a reminder that this is an election not only of the president, but also of the legislature. And I haven't seen any projections yet in terms of result for the legislature's election. However, the anticipation was that if Erdogan did well, apparently to gain a majority in the legislature, his party only needed to capture about 45% of the vote. And so if he personally is polling above 45%, it's likely that they will hold the majority. However, if anybody listening wants to do a quick search and find out what the current projections are for seat count, that would be great. And then the fifth item in the nest is just to highlight, because I found this fascinating, that turnout in Turkey is extremely high for elections. And so that fifth item has a graph that shows election turnout in various countries. I saw some people from Turkey, essentially taking this as a badge of honor to highlight how seriously the Turkish people take their politics. And I heard one person suggest that turnout may even have been higher this year and may have been over 90%. Exit, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, that I saw the turnout for today reported at 94%, which is insane. We could only hope for that in North America.
Absolutely. And I'm just adding one more item to the nest. So I wanted to highlight, there was some talk about, what will the integrity of the voting process be like? Are there concerns about a peaceful transition of power? And so just to set those aside, if you have a look in the nest, hopefully it will populate in a moment. I put up one tweet that the official election monitor came out after polls closed and announced that no major irregularities had been detected in the vote. I saw here on Twitter a few, isolated instances talking about, election monitors, were excluded from the polling station in one location. But I think when the election officials say there were no major irregularities, Turkey has 190,000 polling stations. And so I think the idea is that even if there were isolated problems, they are unlikely to be significant in the result. I also put up in the nest, it should be the second item, a thread on the voting process that takes place there, just in case you were curious, talking about how, everything from they use a transparent ballot box, and they have this committee of observers at every polling station that's 5 people at a minimum, with reps from all the various parties observing the count, and that every single ballot is taken out and shown in front of the observers before it's added to the tally, which is quite a time-consuming process, but it sounds like it would yield high confidence in the results. And to that end, I found it interesting that apparently with 4 candidates for president, and in many regions, 26 parties running for the legislature, apparently the ballots are almost a meter long, which I hadn't appreciated. And so one observer was saying that some polling stations had to be held open past the normal close. The lines were long, and that part of the challenge was that it just took longer to fold up a meter long ballot so that it could be put into the ballot box, which I found amusing. And then hopefully the third item in the nest, it's just not populating for me right now, but was a video with Erdogan stating that if he lost, there would be a peaceful transition of power. And I think that people in Turkey, take that for granted, but that outside observers may be nervous, given that several countries have flirted with, threats that transitions may not be so peaceful, including most recently Brazil. But things are looking good on that front. I have one more set of comments on Turkey, and then we'll move along. And so these actually relate to Twitter to a degree. It was, I think, yesterday, the final day of the election, that Twitter put up a notice saying that at the request of Turkish officials, they would be restricting some content. And this caused some consternation. People were bringing it up around whether Twitter is a defender of freedom of speech. I think that it wasn't obvious who was asking for the restrictions. I mean, certainly it didn't say in Twitter's thread, it didn't say who was asking for the restrictions and what was being restricted. And so some people seem to be using it for like domestic political arguments. But what I've put up in the nest now includes the original tweet that went out from Twitter noting they were restricting some content in connection with the election. The second item should be a tweet by Simon WDC, and he wrote an article for a publication called Turkish Minute on what things were observed to have been blocked by Twitter. And that was the only attempt I saw at noting what was actually blocked, rather than just assuming that it was significant to the outcome. I don't know that at the last minute Twitter had that effect, but it's possible. And then the third item up there is from I believe he's the editor of the Middle East Eye and writes heavily about Turkey, noting that the Turkish government essentially didn't give Twitter very much choice, in that it has been their habit to sometimes say, either comply with us or we'll turn Twitter off entirely. And so, some credit may be due to Twitter in that it has to balance whether it will limit a few things, potentially requesting reasons for that restriction, or just have, the entire platform cut, which would potentially have a greater impact on the election. But I see that Jacoby's hand is up, so I'll pause. Please go ahead, Jacoby.
Forgive me if I heard you or I didn't hear you speak to this, but had you seen some articles in the last day or so reporting on Russia denying meddling in the Turkish elections? And I was trying to put my finger on it, on the particular article that caught my eye. It was a post about the outlet RT claiming that an opposition candidate, it wasn't Kılıçdaroğlu, it was another opposition candidate, I think, had, a larger portion of the electorate behind him than was accurate. And then there was another story that Russia was backing another candidate who wasn't even an opposition candidate, and that it just seemed that they were engaging in, certainly being accused of engaging in quite a propaganda campaign in the election itself.
Yeah, I did see that, and hopefully the items that I'm trying to put in the nest are actually showing up occasionally. So I'm seeing thumbs up, but occasionally my Twitter glitches while I host, and my nest won't update for quite a while. But if you scroll back, it should be at this point maybe the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth item up there. So the fourth item was the fact that the opposition candidate Kılıçdaroğlu had come out and offered essentially a warning to the Russians to say, don't interfere in the election. We have proof that you have been, by developing fake materials. So that fourth item is just news coverage of that from Reuters. But then so in response to that, the Russians said, no, we're not interfering at all. But the fifth item should be a tweet from Bakhti Nishanov. And he is, I think it's a screenshot. Yeah, it is a screenshot from Russia Today, where they were using the election for the purposes of disinformation. And the tweet had said, presidential candidate Parenchek has said that Turkey essentially needs to turn its back on NATO and embrace BRICS, when in fact there is nobody by that name who is actually a candidate for president in Turkey. And so that struck me as an example, even though it's not trying to undermine the opposition in that specific instance. It is clear that Russia is using the circumstances of the election to say things that are not true. I think potentially proving Kılıçdaroğlu's point.
That was the RT article I was thinking of too, in particular. So I'm glad you put it up there. I appreciate that.
I think if you read that Reuters piece on Kılıçdaroğlu accusing the Russians of interfering, he may have had some more specific details in there that are relevant to the actual outcome of the election. So there was the Twitter restriction that matters. I bring this up because we're all here on Twitter, and that's relevant to us. There was the allegation of interference of the Russians, and then there were two other items policy-wise I thought I would mention that connect to Russia. These would be the sixth and seventh items in the nest. The first is that just 2 days before the election, so 2 days ago, Russia came out and announced they would permit Turkey to defer payments on $600 million of energy products that they had purchased by several months until 2024, in any event. And, I guess there can be argument about whether that's just in the normal course of business, but that generally you might try to avoid having hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars in state financing be worked out 2 days before an election, particularly from a country accused of interfering. And so that certainly, at a minimum, it doesn't look good. The second policy item was in the tweet by Namek Tan, and he is an official with the opposition, and in a speech that he gave just 2 or 3 days ago, he came out and said that it would be the opposition's policy that they would quickly formalize a solution with regard to the S-400 air defense systems that Turkey bought from Russia, and which had been a sticking point for closer cooperation between Turkey and its NATO allies, in that using the most advanced Russian air defense systems caused concern for NATO allies that if advanced aircraft were given or allowed to be purchased by Turkey, that there's the potential those Russian systems could gather detailed data via radar of the new aircraft, and that could somehow wind its way back to Russia, whether at time of maintenance or otherwise. And so as a result, Turkey has been excluded from the F-35 program, and it's also contributed to frictions over the provision of F-16s. And so it's interesting that that was the first instance I've heard of a Turkish politician saying they would solve the problem. Now, they didn't specify what that solution was, but I still thought it was an interesting policy development. That's all I had for Turkey. So in the absence of hands, I will keep going on this sort of international overview. I wanted to turn to Pakistan briefly because we referred to it in our last space. There had been some significant protests in Pakistan that had turned violent in several circumstances, with buildings being burned. That was in connection with the arrest of former Prime Minister Khan. And since it had turned violent, and some of those burned buildings were military buildings, which is fairly unique in Pakistan, and the fact that Khan had been removed from his position only a few months earlier, it sounded like there was quite a bit of tension there. So we wanted to keep an eye on that. There had been breaking news on Thursday that the Pakistani Supreme Court had come out and said that Khan's most recent arrest had been done illegally and that he should be released. So the updates, if you have a look in the nest, the first item should be Reuters article. Khan was released, I believe, 2 days ago, and he has actually been released on bail. And apparently he's expected to appear in court again in 2 weeks. If you have a look at the second item, though, it was noted in The Guardian that one of it's interesting, when somebody is released, normally conditions would require behavior by the accused. In this case, apparently a term of his bail was to put on a condition that the government should not arrest him during the 2-week bail period. And I highlight that just because apparently it's a significant enough concern that he may be rearrested, that they had to put it in there. And if he was to be rearrested, I suspect that some of the tension and protesting would ramp up once again. However, even without his being rearrested, if you have a look at the third item in the nest from Agence France Presse, Khan has now come out and begun to call for nationwide protests. So it seems like the confrontation is not yet over. Bringing in an OSINT angle to these developments, the fourth and fifth items. The fourth item was interesting. It's the account net blocks, which will track the accessibility of internet connections in various countries, and that people have begun to use that as a proxy for everything from natural disasters to war to government restrictive policies. And in this case, the BBC noted that in some regions around the time of the protests last week, access to the internet was significantly restricted. Which is interesting. I hadn't seen that in any other coverage. And then finally, the fifth item from Pakistan, again, it's a matter we've talked about in other contexts, is that apparently people were circulating AI-generated images of Khan that purported to have him in prison. And so that's, reminiscent of the now famous images that Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat developed of Trump being arrested when it was announced he would be. And apparently that spread almost immediately, so that people in Pakistan are using AI to generate similar things, and which raises concern about when there are violent protests that have just occurred and may occur again. What role might AI imagery play in stoking tensions like that? Jacoby, go ahead.
I'd just note in relation to concerns about ongoing protests or more protests, in some of the articles that you had up there, I think the NetBlocks article and one other one that was speaking about the curbs on social media restrictions on the internet, or turning it off entirely depending on where you were in the country. That seems to be continuing after Khan was released, and the reporting was just, I think, from yesterday that there has been some opening up of it supposedly on Facebook, and I think it wasn't Twitter, maybe it was YouTube. But it's still heavily restricted, and according to the reporting, particularly in the hopes of curbing protest, and that would seem prescient on the government's part, in that Khan today, I think it was, called for people to come out and protest. So that's interesting.
Thanks for that. It would be a good idea to keep an eye on the NetBlocks account if there's continued tension there, because that may be a leading indicator of I know that in some countries, NetBlocks will even break down accessibility by region. And so that could be a leading indicator of localized protest or tension in Pakistan in the coming days. Yep, go ahead, Jacoby.
One other point on that is that NetBlocks, I think it was them, also reported that this crackdown on internet access, social media access, from their estimation, was the most invasive and comprehensive one that Pakistan seems to have ever experienced, and the most prolonged. Also worth noting.
Thanks for that additional detail. So the final stop in our international overview before getting to Ukraine is South Africa, and this is relevant to Ukraine. So the first item in the nest should be an article from the Financial Times. About a week ago, the United States government came out and said they believe that South Africa has provided arms to Russia. This was in connection with the docking of a Russian ship called the Lady R at a government port, a military port, in December of last year. And it's a roll-on, roll-off ship intended to transport fairly heavy military equipment. And it docked in the middle of the night, and it was gone by the next day. And opposition politicians in South Africa called for answers, and the government didn't respond. However, now that about a week ago, when the United States government said they believe they did provide arms, the government did respond. So the second item in the nest should be a video of South African President Ramaphosa responding to it. Many, including the opposition in South Africa, were dissatisfied with his response, basically suggesting there would, be an investigation, but not outright denying it. And so it's seeming like South Africa probably did provide arms. However, the third item in the nest, just today, given all this sort of background tension, President Zelensky had a phone call with President Ramaphosa. And it doesn't say that they talked about arms supplies to Russia. It just says that they talked about the peace formula, justice, and the fact that international rule of law is very important. And so I think that Zelensky has done a good job of continuing to reach out to leaders who may not be entirely friendly to Ukraine, including Chinese President Xi. And it seems like he's just done the same with regard to the South African president. Fourth item in the nest. This was a little while back. So this was actually 2 weeks ago. And we just didn't have time to work it in. We had previously talked about, after the arrest warrants were put out by the International Criminal Court for Vladimir Putin, several countries came out and to say either we would arrest Putin if he were to visit our country, or we would not. South Africa had been waffling back and forth on it. But this report from the Times in South Africa reported that the Department of International Relations in South Africa has received a legal opinion saying that they couldn't ignore the warrant, and that if Putin were to attend, they would have to arrest him. And Putin's next major international visit outside of the immediate region was due to be to the BRICS summit in Africa, in South Africa, which I think was scheduled to be held in June. And so I haven't heard any response from Russia as to whether Putin continues to plan to attend, or whether South Africa, after having received that legal opinion, whether the government will, sort of abide by the apparently binding laws there. Last point on South Africa, bringing in an OSINT element, should be the fifth item back in the nest. It's a tweet by Marcus Johnson. That same ship that docked there in December and apparently took weapons back to Russia, it's now steaming through the Suez Canal, and its destination on its manifests is Zhejiang, China, and that it has several stops in African ports along the way, including Mozambique, Sudan, and Algeria. But it's really that stop in China that is raising eyebrows to the extent that it is a weapons transportation vessel primarily, and that it previously docked in South Africa. And so that's one OSINT item to keep an eye on. I suspect Marcus and some others will keep paying attention to it. So if you want to follow that, it may be worth following them. Okay. I think that's it for the global review. I did have another tweet up there. I'll just drop it in the nest, but I won't speak to it for the sake of time. That just covers everything from Iran becoming the chair of the UN Human Rights Commission to update on the situation in Sudan that various OSINT accounts are following. So if you're interested in those other international matters, do have a look at that sort of overview thread that I've added to the nest. So moving to Ukraine, I had thought that the most pressing news item was the fact that yesterday 4 aircraft were shot down, 2 jets and 2 helicopters, and that it would be worth running through some details that have come out in connection with that. And so, looking at the nest, the first is a thread from Rob Lee, who does a great job at doing overviews whenever there's breaking news, and he's one of my go-to accounts. And so his thread, that first item in the nest, includes several videos showing the shootdowns, the various shootdowns. It also includes some Russian media coverage of what happened. Sorry, just distracted here for a moment. The second item in the nest should be a link to Russian confirmation. And so I always like to include that wherever possible, because sometimes there are disputes about details, but whenever Russia concedes details, I think that's worth noting. The third item is a tweet that notes that the 2 Mi-8 helicopters that were shot down were actually a special model intended for electronic warfare purposes. And that apparently Russia only has 20 of those specific models in its inventory. And so that's a significant blow to lose 10% of those specialized aircraft in one day. Okay. Sorry, there's just a bunch going on administratively in the background. So I'm queuing a few more items up in the nest that are also about the shoot down. In particular, what caused it, because there's debate over that. Initially, when there were reports that an aircraft had gone down, Russia took the approach of saying that they had experienced engine trouble, which certainly didn't hold up for long. But then other alternatives that were put forward were that the aircraft had been shot down by Russian air defenses. Some went so far as to suggest, like, why would Russia shoot down so many of its own aircraft? So some people went so far as to speculate that perhaps Russian air defense had been hacked. I don't see any evidence of that, but it's out there as a suggestion. There were suggestions that it was Ukrainian air defense. Some said it could have been teams of special operations soldiers with manpads, or that it may actually have been air-to-air missiles. And so I have a few updates on that will help narrow it down. But I see that we have a hand up from Stephen. So you're a new speaker. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I just found this off of Live Ukraine Media Telegram, but Prigozhin has just said that all the Russian aircraft were shot down by Russian air defense in the Bryansk region. All 4 sides of the fall formed a circle with a radius of about 20 kilometers, and he concluded that what air defense system could be located in the center of that circle. So I just thought I would bring that to your attention, and it's a pinned tweet of my profile at the moment. I just downloaded it and uploaded it off Telegram and put it on Twitter.
Great, thanks very much. I had seen people referring to that. So basically, we're going to run through a couple of the different opinions in just a moment. But I see that Wolverine has his hand up. So Wolverine, please go ahead.
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff, because I was watching Russian, Ukrainian, and Wagner's Telegram, Prigozhin actually came out pretty early and said that basically the people in Bryansk were a bunch of dumbasses because they shot down their own aircraft. But one thing that if I can find this. This is one thing I posted yesterday in our chat. But basically, what happened is the Russians had set up these air corridors. Basically, what these are is they're a specific route, altitudes, and a direction and stuff like that the aircraft have to fly in and out of. Because if they don't fly in those corridors, then they potentially can get tagged as enemy aircraft and be shot down. So what happened is all the aircraft that, from what everything that I posted and read, was that basically that's what happened with these aircraft. And you had actually even had that one spot. So I'm just going to read a little bit about this, where you'd actually translated it. Oh my God, that's long. I'm just going to kind of go. So it said permanent routes of entry and exit to the airways, for entry exit to the VT and to the area from the area of the aerodrome in the south. It basically said that there are routes 1, 2, and 3. Route 1 was designated for entry exit in southwest. It gives actually a direction from the actual airfield. So for people who don't know, basically what they put up was RFVT V-23 R-11 R-363 P-808 and their route access, and then that was route access number. So they had all these different route access corridors in place, and basically from a lot of the stuff that I've been reading, going back and forth between the different channels, is that the people in Bryansk, because I assume they're relatively close to the border, they got a little trigger happy and shot down all the aircraft. Some of those corridors, they have the actual elevation on them, and these are in meters, is 1,800 meters to 10,100 meters. That's actually and then except for one had a lower one, it was only 12 to 2,100 meters. So if that corridor, the 12 to 21, that would have been easy for any one of those aircraft to fly out of, and I'm assuming that's probably a route for helicopters. But most of, like I said, most of the stuff that I gone through from those ones said it was initially there were certain people that were already from the beginning, like Prigozhin, saying that it was Russian aircraft, or sorry, Russian air defenses that shot down their own aircraft.
Yeah, I would agree that that's one of the most likely alternatives. And I saw some people, when they saw the video, were saying, why were the jets flying at that height? They seem to be flying particularly high. And others responded that that would seem to have been a condition of the sort of the air corridor through their own air defenses. I guess the idea being that if Ukrainian aircraft tried to fly through, they would never fly at that height. And so I guess the assumption was that the Russian aircraft should be safe that far from the border. And by flying high, their own air defense should be able to recognize, friendlies besides the automatic identification systems. With the speculation, whether those corridors were changed and there was a miscommunication, it's not clear why it should have operated well prior to this, and then all of a sudden 4 aircraft are shot down. That's still seems pretty unusual.
Well, sometimes it goes with coordination, because and you see it all the time in military operations. If that information, it may be passed on if that is set up by the air defense guys, and someone doesn't pass it along to the actual flight crews who are flying out there, well, that can be another issue too, is that they just didn't know. And so when they flew out them, the units in Bryansk were like, oh, hey, they're not in the air corridor, and shoot them down. But the one thing that I see, which I've been going over the channels, I haven't seen anything of, was that at no time did I ever see, at least I haven't seen it, of anything saying where Ukraine's like, oh yeah, we shot those aircraft down. I think that something that big, I think Ukraine would have said, oh yeah, we did, but it's been pretty quiet. And that's another thing that would lead me to believe that they were actually shot down by the Russians, not Ukrainian forces.
Oh, well, so to that end, running through some of the material I put up there, Just to knock down a few of these theories, the first item is a tweet it's a translation of a post by Igor Girkin, who is a Russian military commentator. He was formerly a commander following the 2014 invasion, and he's well known to most of us now. And his opinion was that these aircraft were shot down via man pads from Ukrainians who were on Russian territory. However, that doesn't seem particularly consistent with the evidence. So if you look at the second and third items in the nest, are thoughtful aircraft analysts who note that at least one of them seemed to have been hit by something big enough that it almost blew the entire nose cone off the plane. And if you have a look at the third item in the nest, that's apparently some of the wreckage from one of the wings, where looked like there were significant shrapnel holes in the wings. And the suggestion is that that's inconsistent with the man pad, that it couldn't do damage that significant. So I think it's reasonable to eliminate that one as a possibility. Interestingly, when you say that Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility, on the contrary, they came out today, and I believe the spokesperson is named Yuri Inat, and he said that no, it was the Russians who shot down their own, which is, again, seeming to be the most likely outcome. However, other observers are noting that I think the Russians are denying that they shot down their own planes, which is predictable, but there isn't enough independent evidence to exclude the possibility that the Ukrainians may have used ground-based air defense, something long range, that they moved up very close, which they now have the potential to do with Patriot and similar systems, although that would be potentially quite risky with those advanced systems. One other possibility that has been proposed is that some of the newly received aircraft, particularly some of the MiGs from Poland that had been quite modernized, could potentially have been armed with AIM-120, which are air-to-air missiles that have a range that makes it possible that they could have been used from an aircraft flying near the front. However, so to that end, the fifth item in the nest is a tweet by Tyler Rogaway, who writes for the War Zone, and they do great work. And he talks about how it's possible but unlikely that integration for AIM-120 has taken place yet. However, it is something that is anticipated would be a logical next step, given the integration of HARM and Storm Shadow and a couple of other Western systems. So it can't be excluded yet, but it's probably less likely, and we probably fall back to the scenario Wolverine described, which is Russia shooting down its own. I think Jacoby was first, and then we'll go to Wolverine.
Just going with the idea that maybe it was a scenario where, actually, I'm not saying maybe or speculating. I'm just saying, like, if this happens, what does this necessarily mean in a military arena? If there's a Ukrainian plane or a Ukrainian allied plane in Ukrainian airspace, and they see something and they do use their weaponry to make contact with it over a border, what kind of implications that engagement would have, or that they can't do that given the complexities of of attack, how that would be perceived, if that's actually, because it would seem to me if what they could be hitting would be in Russian airspace, and they're shooting over a borderline, what that would implicate.
Well, that's an interesting question. in that.
And I don't mean to suggest that that's what happened. I'm just theorizing if that were to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting question in that we have heard about Western allies' apparent reluctance to give longer range, missiles like the ATACMS out of fear that they could be fired into Russia proper, and that might be some kind of a red line. I understand there's all kinds of debate about it. I don't know. I'm sure that Russia, whatever happens, will take umbrage and suggest that it's a red line, but I suspect they're not going to do anything about it, as with several other red lines we've crossed. I will note, and perhaps we'll get to it in a minute, but there was a Washington Post article that came out that talked about how President Zelensky had been talking about or exploring some more aggressive alternatives over the course of the war, including potentially attacks cross-border. And I don't take that as a negative, in that I think it's a responsibility of a leader of a country at war to explore all kinds of alternatives. But I think that Ukraine's allies would probably make a distinction between firing on an aircraft that is on its way to cross the border into Ukraine, like it's imminent. It's like stopping a punch, as opposed to punching back. But I suppose we'll fully know the answer to that once we have definitive proof that air-to-air missiles have been provided to Ukraine and used. Until then, it might just be speculation. I think the hand order was Wolverine and then Piotr. Go ahead, Wolverine.
So as far as one thing that which I can't remember, but I know one of them, I think it showed the flight of one of the helicopters. One thing that you would have seen is if there was like a video showing the whole flight, is that if the aircraft was targeted by Ukrainian aircraft, and they had they were able to pick up the missile, their threat receivers, if they were working, should have gone off, and then the aircraft would have automatically started doing some type of evasive maneuvers and launching chaff and flares automatically. That's those U.S. aircraft too. I'm assuming that's how the Russian aircraft systems work as well. But the other thing is when they're doing it, they're doing IFF, identify friend foe. So if the Russians' batteries were locking onto them, they should have used IFF to identify the aircraft. And if either for some reason either they didn't get a return back saying yes, friendly or not, or someone read it wrong and fired at the aircraft. But I remember I thought there was one video, it showed the helicopter in flight and then it showed it getting hit. And I don't think at any time I saw chaff and flares getting ejected from the aircraft, or if the aircraft tried to do any type of maneuvers, because when they pick it up, they would pick it up as their type of radars, and they would say, okay, that's our friendly radars. So they wouldn't really be expecting a missile to be coming up that way. Whereas it was like if it was some type of NATO supplied weapon system or someone else's, and they engaged with the aircraft across the border, the Russian aircraft should have picked them up some way, and they should have done some type of maneuvers or pop chaff and flares while doing that.
That's a good point, and I think that's more circumstantial evidence that it likely was a Russian friendly fire incident, which is what Ukraine is claiming anyway. Piotr, thanks for joining us. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I know I'm coming in at tail's end, so if you've heard this before, but yeah, for me, this whole idea of, and again, I don't know if it's connected, but when we're talking about the development of more advanced systems, I'm not the military perspective. I look at it just from, knock-on effects. And if Ukraine begins to start taking the initiative of launching its own interceptions into Russian airspace, that's a grey area, because I think, you said it, Michael, but if it's in defensive capacity, then that's one thing. A lot of the Russian narratives like to say the Polish, the missile that landed in Poland was Ukrainian made, and therefore it's Ukraine's fault. And it was actually Ukraine who was trying to blow up Poland, all this sort of crap. But it's like, well, that missile was landing in Poland because it was launched to intercept Russian missiles that had been bombarding half of Kiev in the morning. So I think context is important, but the problem is that if the military decides that they want to start doing more offensive strikes, and that completely undermines the narrative of NATO as a defensive force in defense of Ukraine, right? If the Ukrainians are starting to go off and act independently and try to, preemptively stop the Russians from doing certain strikes, I mean, I get it in military doctrine, but it doesn't then help that will sort of probably in some people's eyes legitimize the sort of Russia is being attacked by NATO because they're supporting a Ukrainian force that is attacking Russia, you know what I mean? So that's sort of where my head goes with that. The other thing I wanted to mention, I think, is probably not that relevant, so I'll land there.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think our perspectives are consistent there. And again, we'll certainly find out, because we may cross that bridge sooner rather than later, that it becomes clear what the Western policy is in those countries that support Ukraine. I've put another set of material up there, just with regard to some newly provided equipment that might generate a bit of conversation. The first item is a write-up from the war zone about the evidence that's come out now. It's been 2 or 3 examples of the ADM 160, which is it's a miniature air launch decoy, and apparently these devices are used to penetrate enemy air defense, primarily because they have electronic warfare components on them, which allow them to mimic the signature in many ways of a variety of aircraft or other projectiles, cruise missiles and the like. And so even though they don't have explosive warheads, what I think they're intended to do is have air defense systems turn on in order to engage them and thereby reveal their positions. And given there have been several examples of them in Ukraine in the last 2 or 3 days, it seems like it's been a new delivery. And I've seen a couple of analysis that suggest that in some ways, the provision of these ADM 160 systems might be, on a per unit basis, more significant than things like the Storm Shadow, because they're so effective that they will almost certainly, by mimicking a high value target, lead the Russians to reveal their positions, making a follow-on strike, potentially with something like a HARM anti-radiation missile, very likely to be successful. However, because their delivery wasn't announced, it's assumed that they've come from the United States. It's unclear how many of them they have. Given that several have been used just in a few days, you would assume that they have enough to use them at that rate. Their rate of use may be higher in the very early days of a main push of an offensive, as disabling air defense systems is obviously a priority. In connection with other new equipment, the second item in the nest, the first pictures emerged of debris that appears to be the remains of Storm Shadow missiles. And apparently these were in connection with strikes on locations in Luhansk. Those sites that were hit were not particularly far away. I think I read they were something like 70 or 80 kilometers away, and may even have been within range of HIMARS. And so people were saying, well, why would Storm Shadow have been used there? And I don't know the precise answer, but one theory I saw was that Storm Shadow has to be carried by existing Ukrainian aircraft of Soviet design, and that their integration may need some live tests, and that they may therefore have picked targets that were slightly closer, sort of as a proof of concept. At least that's one theory that's gone around. So actually, I see that Jacoby has put up that Washington Post article I referred to, the interview with President Zelensky, where the article that discloses the fact that President Zelensky had discussed some more aggressive tactics over the last couple of months, in case you wanted to look into that. But then digging back a little further into the fourth and fifth items in the nest, there have been some other strikes behind Russian lines that apparently targeted command and control locations. And in particular, some high-ranking officers were killed. And so the Russians came out and admitted the deaths of 2 colonels. And you can find the link to Russian media admitting that as the fourth item back. Which, some people have talked about the idea of the Storm Shadow as a longer range alternative, going out to almost 300 kilometers, probably over 250 anyway, as pushing back Russian logistic sites, but just to highlight that they may also be used against command sites. And that led to an interesting article that was written from the NATO perspective in a modern conflict. Precision missiles targeting command sites is a major concern. And so the title of that article is The Graveyard of Command Posts, What Can Be Learned from Chernobyevka, which of course is the airport just outside Kherson that was struck over and over and over again. And it seems timely in light of the potential use of Storm Shadow against Russian command sites. I will just queue up a few more things in the nest. And we probably have about 10 minutes left. So as usual, we're not going to get to everything. So I'll try and pick some of the most interesting items. So there were a couple of articles looking at whether what we're seeing is the main effort of the offensive. And I'll note that there's a bit of a split in some analysts. For example, Konrad Muzyka came out and said, it seems like it's undeniable that the offensive has now begun. But then Michael Kaufman came out and said, well, these may be operations associated with the offensive, but it's definitely not the main thrust. So it's still very hard to judge. The 2 items I put up are articles by the New York Times and the Financial Times. And interestingly, they suggest that some of the attacks around Bakhmut may be for different purposes. So the Financial Times suggested that it may be part of the Ukrainian military's effort to test some of its own newly trained units as sort of we have a controlled environment. We have extremely good recon on what the opposing forces are there. They're of dense, high quality. So let's put some of our newly trained units together as a bit of almost a shakedown to see how they do, which is an interesting idea. It hadn't crossed my mind before. But then in contrast to that, the second item in the nest is a link to a New York Times article where they're suggesting that instead the attacks around Bakhmut are really more about testing the Russian positions and seeing how effective the Russians are on defense as a sample that may inform their decision about where and when to aim their main thrust. So it seems like they're shaking things out on both sides. Exit, go ahead.
Actually, I would love to defer to Stepan, who came up, please.
This is a bit of a past point, but when it comes to the command point that was struck, I believe it was struck near Klishchivka, which is to the south of Ivanevsk in Bakhmut. So that was definitely struck by barrel artillery and not by long-range weapons. So just I wanted to correct you there, but other than that, I have nothing to say.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was hoping to suggest that that type of strike against a command site, even though it may not have been carried out by Storm Shadow in that case, Storm Shadow would also enable strikes against command that is, deeper behind the lines. Exit, we'll go to you, and then Wolverine.
It was curious to me that the ADM 160 were not announced as being delivered by the U.S. since they are fairly vocal about those types of things. And I wondered if anybody had any insight as to why that might have been.
Well, Wolverine may have an opinion on that. So if you do, Wolverine, toss that in with your other comment.
It may have been just a last minute thing that they came out with, saying, hey, we have these, they can be used for this and this. And Ukraine was like, okay, yeah, we'll take them. It could be something, a last minute thing. Because my understanding is basically all those things aren't they like dummy missiles or something like that? I don't think they're actual weapon systems that detonated in something, but it could be, if they are something like that, then those can actually be really good because you can use one of those systems instead of an actual aircraft to test and find out where the Russian air defense systems are located at. So if that's what that's what that's for, then yeah, that'd be really good for singling out where they may have air defense units located at. But I don't know too much about the ADM 160. But just going off of what little knowledge I heard, I would say that would be one of the good things you could use it for, as a dummy to draw out Russian air defense systems and find out where they're at. So the other thing I was going to talk about is the offensive around the offenses that are going on around Bakhmut. Just reading and stuff and kind of taking some experience, I think it's more that they're just local counteroffensives. I don't think that they're part of the main offensive. Reason being is because Ukraine is still waiting on other units and more equipment to get in place so that they can form up more of their brigades for their offensive. They may have put some troops there, but there is a map. I can't remember who was put up by. It was one of these Michael Spaces, a month ago maybe, where it showed all the Ukrainian units by name, and it showed that there were not one but 2, 3, or even 4 brigade-size elements in Bakhmut, and along with a lot of different other battalion-size elements as well. So it could be that one of the units there, because not all of the like let's say they had the 93rd, they may have had only 1 or 2 brigades of the 93rd committed, but then they brought in the 4th, their last brigades or battalions, and they committed them. It could have been something like that, or it could have been a unit, that had been sent back, like example. But I know it's not the 47th. But let's say the 47th Brigade, they pulled them back to recuperate and re-equip. And then, they could have potentially sent a unit down there like that. And then because of that, they're able to get, they're able to push back the Russian forces or those additional forces that could have came in. But the thing is like, I just don't think it's part of the overall attack. But, I think what it is the Ukrainians are basically using whatever assets they have. And they are, basically forcing Russia to pull more and more assets of theirs into that one battle, and by doing that, they're basically holding the Russian units in that one spot, bringing in more and more assets. So what it does is, whenever Ukraine kicks off their offensive, then that would be less Russian forces that will be available to counter any of the Ukrainian attacks that come whatever direction they're going through. I've seen stuff where there have been vehicles being pulled out of what's the port there, Bryansk? That's by Mariupol. And then even Mariupol, vehicles been put on tractor trailers and loaded up, taken to different spots. Could be Melitopol or Tokmak, don't know where exactly. But they have been pouring more equipment out to reinforce units that have lost it. And I think a lot of it is coming out of mainly the Bakhmut area right now.
Yep, that's certainly engaging Russian troops to sort of pin that.
Yeah, you want to check your microphone?
And maybe we'll go to Charles, because I suspect he has an answer for my question as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to your question, Exit, about the decoys and why it wasn't announced. I was speaking with John Ridge earlier this week about the decoys, and this is not my area of expertise, so I have to sort of kind of relay a bit what we were discussing. Is that this approach to cruise missile strikes with using decoys is a relatively old tactic within the U.S. Army or NATO armies. So my suspicion here, and this is just my suspicion, is that by announcing something like that, it would have telegraphed that cruise missiles would be delivered to Ukraine.
Interesting that there was speculation, not just cruise missiles, but also that idea of use of harms, that maybe they wanted to get the element of surprise on a couple of attacks. But it will be very interesting to see whether anything else that has not been announced pops up in the next few weeks. I think that's entirely possible. So thanks for that answer. Stepan, did you want to go ahead?
In response to decoy's point, I've actually recently heard an interesting thing about HIMARS use, where the Russians, after several months, they're not just starting to be able to jam them, some crews are also able to shoot them down. So what the Ukrainians have started to do is use HARM missiles in conjunction with HIMARS strikes to, quote, distract the Russian air defense. So decoys may also be supplied to help HIMARS strikes, because how the decoy works, this specific one, I believe it doesn't just deploy, it's not just a decoy, it also deploys electronic warfare and active decoy. So it deploys, I believe it deploys flares and chaff. So I think that decoy is also kind of, it's considered a response to Russians adapting to HIMARS strikes. And as we know, HIMARS will be very important in the upcoming offensive. And in response to Wolverine's point, we at War Translate, we monitor Russian Telegram channels, and the general consensus there is very in line with Wolverine's thinking, where they believe that the attacks in Bakhmut are carried out by local Ukrainian units. So, for example, the 3rd Assault, formerly Azov Brigade, and they believe that the objective there is to deplete Russian reserves, which they already say are in a very poor state following the Russian offensives at Vuhledar, Avdiivka, and Bakhmut. So they basically, in short, believe that the Ukrainians are trying to exhaust the remaining Russian reserves before the counteroffensive, and then strike in the south. And one of them, Moors, even believes that the Ukrainians will launch a full-on offensive on the Donetsk axis as a distraction to the southern offensive. So what they're thinking is very much in line with what Wolverine was saying.
Sorry, there was just a delay on my mic button there. That's an interesting point about the HIMARS strikes. I hadn't considered that, so that's interesting. It may be an adaptation. So anyway, thanks for that back and forth, additional details, guys. I'm going to mention just 2 or 3 last points from recent developments, and then we'll probably wrap it up for today. The recent developments I'll note, starting with the first item in the nest, is it was announced by the U.S. that the Kinzhal missile that was apparently intercepted by a Patriot was actually aimed at the Patriot battery itself. which is an interesting twist on the engagement. And that begs the question as to whether the Russians actually identified the Patriot battery and were specifically targeting it, or whether it was just believed to be an air defense asset. It's not clear whether they knew the significance of the battery itself. But I guess that also has implications in terms of the need to move the battery around, and that may also, depending on where the wreckage from the Kinzhal was, may give an indication of how close to the front line that Patriot actually was deployed, which is interesting. Second, well, it's not the second item in the nest anymore. It's now the fourth item in the nest. It's one of the latest messages from Prigozhin. I'll admit I kind of question how much time we should spend following what he says, in that he says a lot and there's a lot of drama, but not a lot comes of it. However, because he's becoming increasingly aggressive in his rhetoric, I think it's at least worth mentioning. In this particular video, he basically says that the Russian soldier who feels like they've had their efforts wasted, and that they haven't been supported, that they will eventually figure out who it was who hung them out to dry, essentially, and that they'll take revenge on those people, which some observers are suggesting sounds an awful lot like Prigozhin is calling for rebellion or revenge against the leadership that has failed. I suspect that, he's doing it in neutral enough phrasing in terms of he's not calling for it. He's just saying it's likely to happen. He's not naming names. When he was calling people names the other day, where it was believed he could potentially have been referring to Putin, I think clarification came out where it was, no, I'm referring to Gerasimov. So anyway, I'm sure it will be couched in all kinds of ways, but he's definitely flirting with the edge of, open rebellion. So I don't know how much more he can possibly escalate without definitely stepping over that line. So I suspect we've either reached the height of the drama or it's about to massively accelerate once the offensive gets going. So it'll be interesting to see which of those two it is. And then I think the second last point I put up there, it's a tweet. It's the fifth back by Decoding Trolls. And it's there was a strike the other day against, I think it was Pavlorod, where it's believed that what was struck was decommissioned ICBM engines, and that they had all kinds of, I believe, solid fuel in them that caused a massive explosion when struck. And there was fear that it may have been a Ukrainian ammo depot of some kind, but the decommissioned engines are far less significant. However, there was another strike just the other day where it's believed another depot of decommissioned rocket engines was also hit, which begs the question, is Russia specifically targeting them? That two should be hit like that in close succession? And if so, why would those items be targeted? And I saw some Ukrainians say, well, you shouldn't laugh at it as in, oh, you're hitting these irrelevant sites because it causes significant environmental damage by the release of the unpleasant chemicals in these engines. But I put it up because it's interesting to think Russia may actually be targeting them specifically. And the suggestion is maybe they're doing it because they anticipate, like, they're old enough sites that they know where they are, and the Russians anticipate a large explosion that they can then try to use for PR purposes domestically to say, we hit something significant. But that's the best analysis of it that I've seen. Final point I'll say for today is there was an interesting interview with Ukrainian head of the armed forces, Commander Zaluzhny, and it was apparently his first video interview, and it's in Ukrainian, but I've put up sort of a summary highlight of the major points. And if you look in the replies to that tweet, there is a link to the YouTube video itself. So if you're get right down into the details of everything that's going on in Ukraine, then that's probably one you don't want to miss. So with that, we're going to wrap up. As usual, I haven't had time to get to a whole bunch of the material that I had prepared, but that's how it goes. You'd think I would learn by now. But I would invite you that if you look at the thread I put up in my pinned tweet, you can find all that content that we didn't have a chance to get to, and you can still read up on it. And some of it that's still timely, we may push forward to our next conversation, which is scheduled for this coming Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'll put a link to it in the Nest now so that you can set your reminders for it. And in addition to that, I'll draw your attention in the Nest. Normally, Aaron Bouma will hold a space on Sunday evenings. In this case, he shifted it to Monday night. So please make note of that. There is a link to his space up in the Nest as well. And then finally, just a reminder, we heard from Exit earlier that her geolocation puzzle from last week hadn't had anybody solve it all the way through. And so we're just going to keep it rolling for this. We're just going to keep it rolling for this week. So that's up there. I invite you to play along. I'll probably give it a shot this week. And hopefully by either Thursday or next Sunday, we'll have somebody who's cracked it. And then they can come up and explain how they solved the hard problem. So I think that's it for today. Thank you to everybody who joined us. We had, I think, a very interesting interview with Sam Bendet, an expert on drones and AI, who was speaking to us about crowdfunding efforts in Russia. And then we complemented that with a conversation with a friend of ours, Konstantin, who is doing similar crowdfunding work in support of Ukraine. And it was neat to see both sides of that coin. We heard about the interim results of the Turkish election, which at this point is trending toward a runoff 2 weeks from now. So we'll keep an eye on that subject. And then we had enough time to cover just the recent highlights from Ukraine. So as a last point, we'll let Piotr come in.
Yeah, thank you. You had Sam in. That's nice. Good to know. He's joining some of your spaces. We had a chat with him on Friday as well, which I think was quite good. And yeah, since you mentioned Turkey, I mean, that's been my main focus for this evening. My mother was quite pissed. First time I've seen her in about a month. And I'm spending half my time on my phone watching the results come in. But I don't know. I think it's going to go to a runoff, and I'm not feeling overly optimistic, if I'm honest. But that being said, I mean, this is the biggest challenge Erdogan has had in his presidency. And I think it's going to, even if he remains in power, severely weakened his position because he just doesn't have the same, clout that he maybe did, even though the party, I think, will probably retain power over the parliament system. But yeah, we're going to have another space on that later this week. I just posted it in the Nest, if that's okay, Michael, like a post-election review. We had a preview, and I'm going to have a review with a couple of people, maybe like 3 or 4 panelists, one of which was at the Turkish polls in Istanbul, which is quite cool. So yeah, that's what I wanted to do. But thanks a lot for your space. Always appreciate it.
Yep, that's great. So that's on Tuesday at 2 p.m. And I know I'll try to make it to hear that as well. So thank you very much to everybody for coming to listen today. Thanks to all the speakers. I think that just about everybody who spoke, they're following the events very closely. I think just about everybody who spoke is someone you should check out, and most of them deserve a follow. And great thanks to my co-hosts, Exit and Jacoby. To be honest, without your guys' help, I couldn't run these spaces. So I look forward to seeing you guys all on Thursday night at 9 p.m. Have a good night.